Silas Boone tore the envelope in half before the man who delivered it could say another word. The offer inside represented more money than most men in Wyoming Territory would see in a lifetime. His hands were still bleeding from the morning's fence work. His boots were held together with wire, and Augustus Caldwell, the most powerful rancher in the territory, had just sent his own daughter to buy back the dream Silas had spent 11 years earning. She stood at his gate, beautiful and uncertain. He threw the money in the dirt. If you believe a broke man can outfight a millionaire on his own broken land, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Wyoming Territory, 1889. The morning Silas Boone first walked the property line of Dawson Creek Ranch. He did it alone, before sunrise, before anyone in the valley could see the expression on his face. He had learned, over 35 years of living, that a man's feelings were safer when nobody was watching them. He started at the eastern edge, where the old fence had collapsed entirely, post after post rotted at the base and fallen sideways into the frozen grass like soldiers who had given up the fight. He walked the southern boundary where 2 gates had come off their hinges and were lying in the mud, covered with a season of dead leaves. He walked the field that once produced enough hay to feed 200 head of cattle through a Wyoming winter, now so choked with weeds and wild brush that you could barely see the shape of the land underneath. He circled the barn, the enormous, proud structure that had made Dawson Creek famous once, and he pressed his palm flat against the sidewall where the timber had split, where moisture had gotten inside, where whole sections of the roof had given way to time. He stood there for a long while with his hand against that broken wall. Then he nodded once quietly, to himself. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." There was nobody else there to hear it. Nobody to share the vision he carried in his chest, the picture of what this place had once been and what it could become again. No partner to slap him on the back and tell him he wasn't crazy. No family member to caution him, no friend to warn him that he was making a mistake. Just Silas, the broken fence, the collapsed barn, the empty fields, and 11 years of hard-saved wages sitting in a bank account in Cheyenne. He had paid $740 for Dawson Creek Ranch. $740 represented every dollar he had not spent on himself since the age of 24. It was the price of 11 winters sleeping in bunkhouses, 11 summers working from first light to last, 11 years of saying no to everything that might have made life more comfortable in the short term, because he was building towards something. A thing of his own, a place with his name on the deed that no foreman could take away from him, no bad season trip from him, no wealthy rancher could reassign. $740, and the deed to the most embarrassing piece of land in Carbon County. People in the town of Miller's Crossing had opinions about that. They had plenty. Silas had ridden through town the morning after the sale was finalized, stopping at the feed store to place his first supply order. He had his list folded in his shirt pocket, written carefully in pencil, because he had taught himself to read and write on his own during lantern-lit evenings in bunkhouses across Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. He had spread the list on the counter and started going through it methodically, and that was when Calvin Marsh, who owned the feed store and apparently felt entitled to comment on other people's decisions, had leaned his elbows on the counter and said, "You actually went through with it?" "I did. Dawson Creek. That's the one." Calvin shook his head, already smiling with the particular pleasure of a man who expected to be proven right. "Boone, that property broke a good rancher. Fellow who had it before you had 20 years of experience and a full crew." He walked away with nothing, barely got the clothes off his back. He said it like he was doing Silas a kindness. Like the information was a gift. Silas folded the list. "You going to fill this order or not, Calvin?" "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." He held out the list. "You going to fill it?" Calvin filled it, but he told everyone who came into the store that morning what Silas Boone had done, and by evening the story had gotten around most of Miller's Crossing, and the general verdict was some version of the same thing. Poor fool. didn't know any better, would be back in a bunkhouse before harvest season. What none of them understood, what a man like Calvin Marsh was not built to understand, was that Silas had not bought Dawson Creek because he thought it would be easy. He bought it because he had spent 11 years watching wealthy men throw away things that still had life left in them. He had watched ranchers burn fence sections rather than repair them, sell off livestock for a fraction of value because a single bad season frightened them, walk away from land that was bruised but not dead, simply because it required more than they wanted to give. He had cleaned up after those decisions his entire working life, doing the unglamorous work that made other men's properties function, and the whole time he had been thinking, watching, absorbing everything he could learn about what a ranch needed to survive. Dawson Creek had not failed because the land was bad. It had failed because the man who owned it gave up. Silas Boone had never given up on anything in his life, and he was not about to start now. He set up his camp in the old ranch house that first night. The house was still standing, which was more than could be said for several of the outbuildings. The windows needed replacing, the floor had soft spots where water had gotten in, and the fireplace had a cracked flue that he would need to address before winter. But the bones were good. He could feel it the way you could feel a reliable horse underneath you. The fundamental structure of the thing was sound, and everything else was just work. He built a fire in the yard instead of the house that first night, cautious about the flue until he could fix it properly, and he sat on an overturned crate eating cold beans from a tin, looking out at the dark shape of the land around him. The mountains were enormous in the distance, black against a sky full of stars, and the valley was so quiet, he could hear the creek running somewhere off to the north, the one that gave the ranch its name. Still moving. Still doing what it had always done, regardless of the human failures that had happened around it. He thought about his mother then, the way he sometimes did in quiet moments. She had died when he was 12, on a Kansas farm that never produced enough to keep them comfortable, and his clearest memory of her was not her face but her hands, rough, capable hands that never stopped moving, that were always fixing or building or tending to something. She had believed, with a quietness that never needed to announce itself, that effort was its own kind of prayer. That doing good work, honest work, was a way of respecting the life you had been given. He thought about her hands when he looked at the broken land around him. Then he picked up his own hands and looked at them in the firelight. Same story written there. He was on the fence line before dawn the next morning. The first 2 weeks were about understanding the scope of what needed doing. He walked every inch of the property with a notebook, the same kind of cheap composition book he had used to teach himself to read, making notes about priorities, about what needed to happen before winter, what could wait until spring, what was urgent for the safety of any livestock he brought in. He mapped the water sources. He tested the soil in several of the fields, digging down with a hand tool to see what the years of neglect had done to the composition. He assessed the barn, post by post, beam by beam, spending a full morning up in the hayloft with a lantern, pressing his palms against the timber, finding what was solid and what would need replacing. The barn was going to be the great project. He could see that. The house could wait. He could live rough for a good while longer. He had done it for 11 years, and a man didn't need much. But the barn was the heart of a working cattle ranch, and without a functioning barn there was no point bringing in animals, and without animals the whole enterprise was just a man repairing fences on a property that produced nothing. He started with the fence. Not because it was the most important thing, but because it was the thing that needed doing every day, regardless of what else happened, the long, slow, patient work of rebuilding a boundary that would eventually mean something. He worked from the eastern edge methodically, one post at a time. He dug the old rotted posts out of the ground by hand. He cut new posts from timber he bought in Miller's Crossing and hauled back on his wagon. He set them in the ground at the correct depth, packed the earth tight around each one, strung the wire carefully, checked the tension. One section, one morning at a time. He talked to himself while he worked, which was a habit he had developed over years of solitary labor, not the rambling of a man who had lost his grip on himself, but a quiet, running commentary that helped him think. He would reason through problems out loud. He would remember things he had read and repeat them under his breath. Sometimes he would just say the name of the next task, a kind of orientation, a way of staying anchored to the present moment. Next post. Drive it deep. Check the level. Good. 3 weeks into this routine, he heard a horse approaching on the road from the north. He straightened up from the fence, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. It was not a working horse. Even from a distance he could see that. The animal was too well kept, the coat a shine, the tack expensive. And behind the horse came a carriage, not one of the practical battered wagons the working ranchers of the territory drove, but a proper closed carriage with polished fittings and a driver in a clean coat on the box. Silas set down his wire pliers and waited. The carriage stopped at his gate. The driver climbed down and opened the door with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of long employment in a wealthy household, and a young woman stepped down. She was perhaps 26 years old, with dark hair pinned carefully under a hat that had clearly been purchased somewhere more refined than Miller's Crossing. She was a plus-size woman, with a soft round face and dark, serious eyes. Dressed in a traveling coat that was well made but practical, not the costume of a woman who never left her parlor. She looked at the property around her with an expression that was hard to read, and then she looked at Silas, and she walked toward the fence with a directness that surprised him. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. I'm Eleanor Caldwell. She said the name without emphasis, without the expectation of impact that he had sometimes seen in wealthy people, that slight pause they gave the name to allow the other person time to react. She just said it the way you would give any piece of necessary information. My father is Augustus Caldwell. Silas knew the name. Everyone in Carbon County knew the name. Augustus Caldwell owned somewhere north of 30,000 acres, ran several thousand head of cattle, and had enough influence with the territorial government that his opinion on grazing rights carried the weight of informal law in 3 counties. He was not a man who sent his daughter to deliver messages, unless the message was important. What can I do for you, Miss Caldwell? Silas said. She opened a small leather satchel she was carrying and withdrew an envelope. She held it out to him across the fence. My father asked me to deliver this. He took the envelope. He opened it and read the letter inside. It was short. Augustus Caldwell was not a man who wasted words. The letter said in plain terms that Caldwell was prepared to pay Silas $1,200 for Dawson Creek Ranch. The number was written out in full $1,200, and below it was a brief explanation. Caldwell wanted to expand his eastern grazing boundary, and the Dawson Creek property sat directly in the path of that expansion. He had attempted to purchase the property before Silas bought it, the letter noted, and had been outmaneuvered by Silas's faster paperwork, a detail that carried a faint edge beneath its polite language. The offer was more than Silas had paid, significantly more. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, and held it out to Eleanor Caldwell. No thank you, ma'am. She looked at the envelope in his hand. She did not take it. Mr. Boone, she said carefully, that offer is nearly double what you paid. I know that. My father doesn't make offers he expects to be refused. Then he should have moved faster on the purchase. He kept his voice even, no heat in it, no apology. Just the facts as he understood them. The land is mine now, Miss Caldwell. Your father's money is welcome to stay wherever it is. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her face, and he could see something moving behind it, not the displeasure he expected, not the offended pride of a wealthy family being told no. Something more like calculation, genuine thought. Do you understand, she said slowly, what my father's opposition to your presence here will mean practically? He controls the water rights on the North Tributary. He has relationships with every supply merchant and labor contractor between here and Laramie. I understand, Silas said, and you still refuse. Yes, ma'am. Why, she asked. It was a direct question, asked without pretense. He respected that. He thought about the answer for a moment because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. Because this land cost me years of my life, he said finally. And your father's money can't buy something I fought to earn. That's not stubbornness, Miss Caldwell. That's just arithmetic. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the fence he had been building. She looked at it with a professional attention he had not expected, her gaze moving along the line of posts, studying the work. Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, and he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching. She took the envelope from his outstretched hand. "I'll relay your answer to my father," she said. She turned and walked back toward the carriage. Silas watched her go. There was something in the way she carried herself that caught his attention, not the carriage of a woman who had been pampered and protected, but the posture of someone who was accustomed to carrying more weight than people assumed. Not just physical weight, something heavier than that. The carriage disappeared around the bend in the road. Silas picked up his pliers. He went back to work. He expected that to be the end of it. He expected lawyers next, or some kind of pressure on his supply lines the way Eleanor had warned him. He shored up his plans accordingly, making arrangements with a merchant 2 towns over for supplies. Identifying the creek access points that were clearly on his own property and could not be disputed regardless of what Caldwell controlled on the northern tributary. He was prepared for a fight. What he was not prepared for was Eleanor Caldwell returning 3 days later. Alone, no carriage this time. She came on horseback, riding a solid bay mare with the ease of someone who had spent serious time in the saddle. She was dressed differently, a work coat. Instead of the traveling coat, practical boots, her hair pulled back simply. She tied the mare to his gate post and walked up the line to where he was working, and she did not offer a greeting. She just stopped beside him and looked at what he was doing. He waited. "You're placing those posts wrong," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The angle." She crouched down beside the last post he had set, pressing her fingers into the earth around its base. The winter before last was particularly bad. Changed the frost heave pattern in this valley. The ground contracts differently now than the old fence was built for. She stood and brushed the dirt from her glove. If you set them at the standard angle, they'll shift in the first hard freeze, and you'll lose half this section before spring. He stared at her. "Where did you learn about frost heave patterns?" he said. "The same place I learned everything useful," she said flatly. On a ranch, watching, listening, and being underestimated, she met his eyes steadily. "Do you want to argue about it? Or do you want to know the correct angle?" He had been building fences for 15 years. He had fenced properties in Nevada, in Utah, in 2 different parts of Wyoming. He did not particularly enjoy being told he was doing something wrong. But he was also, above everything else, a practical man. "Tell me the angle," he said. She told him. He adjusted his next post. By the end of that afternoon, he had reset 3 previous posts at the corrected angle and completed 2 new sections with her adjustment incorporated, and the fence looked better. It sat differently in the ground, more settled, more permanent. He could feel it when he pressed his hand against it, that difference between work that would last and work that was just good enough. She stayed for 3 hours. She did not offer conversation beyond what was practical, and he did not push for any. They worked alongside each other in the way that people do when they are both accustomed to serious work. No wasted words, performance of sociability, just the task and the shared attention to getting it right. When the light began to fail, she pulled on her coat and walked back toward where her horse was tied. "Miss Caldwell," he called after her. She turned. "You were right about the angle," he said. "I appreciate it. No false modesty, no minimizing of the thing. Just acknowledgement." Then she mounted the bay mare and rode back toward the Caldwell property. He stood watching the empty road for a long time after she was gone. He had spent 11 years working on other people's ranches. In that time he had met women of every kind, from hardworking homesteaders' wives who could outride most men in the territory, to daughters of wealthy ranchers who treated the land as scenery rather than a working reality. He had very rarely met a woman who combined both things: the understanding of actual ranch work, technical, physical, unglamorous, with the social position that should have insulated her from needing to know any of it. Something about Eleanor Caldwell did not fit the story he would have told about her before today. He thought about that as he made his supper. He thought about the way she had crouched upside with a oink mooring about her coat. The way she had spoken directly, without the softening language that women in her position were usually trained to use around men they needed to disagree with. The way she had said I was underestimated, like it was simply a fact, a weather condition she had learned to account for, not a wound. He slept badly that night, which was unusual for him. Silas was generally a man who slept the way he worked, completely and without interruption. But something kept pulling him up out of rest, some low hum of thinking that wouldn't settle. And in the gray hour before dawn, he lay on his bunk looking at the ceiling of the old ranch house and admitted to himself that he was not thinking about the fence. She came back again 4 days later, and then again 3 days after that. Each time she came alone on the bay mare, dressed for work. Each time she offered no explanation for her presence, and he asked for none. He began to expect her, the way you begin to expect weather, not always exactly when it was coming, but feeling something in the air that told you to look north. They repaired the southern gate together, which was a two-person this job he had been managing awkwardly on his own, by propping one side with a log. She held the gate frame steady while he reattached the hinges, passing tools without being asked, anticipating the next step in the process with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work, often enough to read its rhythm. "You don't have to keep coming here, he said, when they were setting the gate back into its posts. "I know that," she said. "Your father is not going to be pleased." "My father," she said, not looking up from what she was doing, "has not been pleased with my choices since I was approximately 14 years old, and I was more interested in learning about soil composition than needlepoint." She paused. "Lift your side an inch." He lifted his side an inch. "Thank you," she said. "Hold it there." He held it there. "Does that bother you?" he said, him being displeased. She was quiet for a moment, fitting the hinge pin carefully. "It used to bother me a great deal," she said. "It is not as comfortable to disappoint someone you love as people make it sound in theory." She tested the hinge. "But I have spent most of my life doing what other people believed was appropriate for a woman of my appearance, and I have found that the cost of that arrangement is considerably higher than the cost of his displeasure." He looked at her then. She was still focused on the gate, her expression matter of fact, as if she had said something no more remarkable than a comment about the weather. "What do you mean?" he said slowly. "A woman of your appearance." Now she looked at him. There was something careful in her eyes, a gauging, as if she was deciding how much to say. "Mr. Boone," she said, "I am a plus-size woman. That fact has shaped other people's expectations of me every single day of my life. What I should want, what I was capable of doing, what kind of life was realistic for someone who looked the way I look." She said it without drama, without asking for sympathy. Just laying it down the same way she laid down facts about soil and frost lines. People spend a great deal of time and energy telling such a woman what her limits are. I stopped listening a while ago, though the effort of not listening never entirely goes away. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about Calvin Marsh at the feed store, so certain of what Silas Boone was capable of, that he had felt comfortable announcing it to a room full of people before Silas had had a single chance to prove anything. "I reckon I understand something about that," he said quietly. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a loosening, the smallest reduction in the careful distance she usually maintained. "Yes," she said, "I imagine you do." They rehung the gate in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Something had been said that changed the texture of the air between them. Not resolved, not concluded, just named. Set down on the table between two people who had each been carrying it alone for a long time. The gate swung properly on its new hinges, clean and true. "Good," she said, testing it. "Good," he agreed. The weeks that followed were some of the most productive of Silas's life. Not just because of the work they accomplished together, though that was real and substantial, more fence repaired, the fields cleared of brush in sections that would have taken him twice as long alone. The first serious assessment of the barn's repair needs approached systematically rather than the way he had been approaching it, which was to stand at the door and feel overwhelmed. It was the conversations. They happened in the working way of conversations between two people who are busy, not sitting across from each other with the deliberate purpose of talking, but unfolding sideways, emerging from silences, growing out of practical observations that turned into something else. He learned that she had grown up walking every acre of the Caldwell property with her father, that Augustus had taught her land management from the time she could ride, that she had an instinctive understanding of cattle that most of her father's hired hands lacked, and that this knowledge was largely invisible to everyone around her because of assumptions about who she was. She learned that Silas had been born in Kansas, that his parents had farmed a losing piece of ground until the farm failed, and his father had disappeared sometime after that, that his mother had raised him and his younger brother on whatever work she could find until she died when he was 12, that he had been working on ranches since he was 13 years old. 11 years, she said, one evening, sitting on the rail of the rebuilt southern fence, the late sun going gold across the valley. You saved for 11 years, nearly 12, he said. But 11 once you account for the lean years. You never spent it. Never touched it. I touched it once, he said. My brother needed money to apprentice with a printer back in Kansas City. I gave him what he needed. He looked out at the fields. That set me back about 8 months. I didn't mind. She was quiet, looking at the same fields. Do you ever doubt it, she said. The choice you made, spending everything on a broken place. He thought about that honestly. Every morning before I get up, he said. Then I get up, and I don't doubt it anymore. She turned her head and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that he had seen in mirrors, in rivers, in still water at dawn, the expression of a person recognizing a version of themselves in someone else. People say I have no sense either, she said, coming here. Helping a man my father considers an obstacle, do they? They do. A pause. I don't particularly care. He looked at her. The long, careful lines of her face in the evening light. The way she held herself, not the stiffness of someone trying to appear smaller than they were, but the settled solidity of someone who had long since stopped apologizing for the space they occupied. There was something in that posture that he searched for the right word, steadying. Like a well-built fence, like good timber, Miss Caldwell, he said. Eleanor, she said. At this point I think we can dispense with Miss Caldwell. Eleanor, he said. In all my years of working other people's land, I never once had someone tell me I was placing the fence post wrong and turn out to be right. She raised an eyebrow. That is either a compliment, she said, or a commentary on the quality of your previous coworkers. Both, he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. A genuine one, unguarded, quick, and real. It changed her face entirely, and then was gone again, returned to the careful composure she usually wore. But the echo of it stayed in the air, and he found himself holding very still, the way you hold still when something rare lands near you and you don't want to startle it away. He did not examine what he was feeling. He was not by nature a man who examined feelings. He found it more practical to pay attention to actions, because actions told you what a person actually was, regardless of what they said or felt or believed about themselves. But sitting on that fence rail in the evening light with Eleanor Caldwell, he was aware, with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable, that he had not felt this way in the company of another person since he could remember. Not lonely. That was not a small thing for a man who had been alone, in the truest sense, for most of his adult life. The easy days ended on a Tuesday morning when Augustus Caldwell's ranch foreman, a large, humorless man named Doyle, arrived at Silas's gate with 2 other ranch hands and a short, direct message, Mr. Caldwell was requesting his daughter's presence at home, immediately, and Mr. Boone should understand that Miss Eleanor would not be returning to the Dawson Creek property. Silas was at the gate when they arrived. He looked past Doyle's shoulder to where Eleanor had come out of the barn when she heard the horses. "Eleanor," Doyle said, not looking at Silas, "your father is waiting." Eleanor walked forward. She stopped beside Silas, not behind him. Beside him. "Tell my father," she said, "that I will come home this evening." Doyle's jaw tightened. He said immediately, "Miss." "And I said this evening." She met the foreman's eyes with a steadiness that Silas recognized as practiced the look of someone who had been managing domineering men since childhood. "If he would like to discuss it, he is welcome to come here himself." Doyle looked at Silas for the first time. It was not a friendly look. "You're causing trouble for this family," he said. "I'm building a fence," Silas said calmly. "I know what you're doing." "Then you know more than me," Silas said, "because from where I'm standing, I'm just a man on his own land, minding his own work." Doyle stared at him for a long moment. Then he wheeled his horse and rode back toward the Caldwell property, the two ranch hands trailing behind him. Eleanor let out a slow breath. "He'll tell my father exactly what I said," she told Silas. "I expect he will. My father will come himself." "I expect that too." She turned and looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this complicates things for you." He looked at her, this woman who had come to his broken ranch with a message designed to remove him, who had come back on her own to teach him about frost lines, who had spent weeks helping him build something from nothing, without asking for anything in return, who had stood beside him, not behind him, when the foreman came. "Nothing about this is complicated," he said quietly. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back into the barn to finish what she had been doing. Silas picked up his tools. He went back to the fence. He was setting the last post of the day when a rider appeared on the north road, not from the Caldwell direction this time, but from town. A boy from the telegraph office, riding fast, his face set with the urgency of someone carrying news that wasn't good. The boy pulled up at the gate and held out the telegraph slip without ceremony. Silas took it and read it. It was from Calvin Marsh, which surprised him, because Calvin Marsh had never done him a kindness in his life. But the message was short and the content was plain. There was talk in town that Caldwell was calling in a favor with the county clerk's office, something about the original deed paperwork on the Dawson Creek property. Questions about whether the previous owner had had the legal standing to sell. Silas read it twice. He folded it and put it in his pocket. He paid the boy a nickel, and the boy rode back toward town. Eleanor came out of the barn to find him standing at the fence with one hand on the last post, looking at nothing. "What is it?" she said. He showed her the telegraph. She read it. Her expression did not change, but something went very still in her face, the way water goes still before it freezes. "He can't do that," she said. "The deed is clear. The sale was legitimate." "He can slow things down," Silas said. "Raise questions. Make it expensive and difficult enough that I can't afford to fight it." "He wouldn't." She stopped herself. Something moved across her face. A shadow of recognition. "He might," she said more quietly. "Eleanor." He waited until she looked at him. "I need you to understand something. Whatever happens with that deed, I am not leaving this property. I will not be driven out. I want to be clear about that, so you can decide what that means for you." She was quiet for a moment. "What it means for me," she said slowly, "is that I will go home tonight and speak to my father directly." Her voice was controlled and precise, but there was something underneath it that was not controlled at all. Something that had been building for a long time and had found at last a surface to push against. "He has run this valley for 30 years by making things difficult enough for people that they choose the easy path. I have chosen the easy path most of my life because the cost of not choosing it seemed too high." She looked at Silas. "I have recently come to reassess that calculation." He did not say anything. She mounted the bay mare and rode north toward the Caldwell property. He watched her go. Then he looked down at his hands, roughened, calloused, bleeding slightly at one knuckle from the afternoon's fence work, and he thought about his mother's hands, about effort as a kind of prayer, about the difference between things that were valuable because they were easy to hold, and things that were valuable because they were worth holding on to. He looked at the fence he had built, one post at a time. One section at a time, one day at a time. He thought about Eleanor Caldwell standing beside him at the gate instead of behind him. He thought about a woman who had spent her whole life being what she could not be, coming to a broken ranch to correct a man's fence post and staying because she chose to. Not because she was asked, not because it was expected. Because she chose it. The sun dropped behind the mountains. Silas went inside to make his supper. He was not afraid of what was coming. He had spent 11 years preparing for something hard. He just hadn't known until now exactly what it was going to be. Eleanor rode hard back to the Caldwell property that evening, and she did not slow down until the main house was in sight. She had made the ride 100 times in her life. She knew every turn, every rock, every place where the trail dipped toward the creek and climbed back up again. But tonight the familiar road felt different beneath her, the way roads feel when you are riding toward something instead of away from it, and she was aware, with a clarity she had not felt in a long time, that whatever happened in the next hour was going to determine the shape of the rest of her life. She tied the mare at the post and went inside without waiting to be announced. Augustus Caldwell was in his study. He was a large man, in his early 60s, with a face built for authority, strong jaw, sharp eyes, the kind of physical presence that had won him arguments before a word was spoken. He had built his empire the way a man builds a wall, stone by stone, year by year, without apology. Eleanor had loved him her entire life and been frustrated by him for nearly as long, because he loved her with the same absoluteness he applied to everything else, which meant his love sometimes looked from the inside, indistinguishable from control. He was standing at his desk when she came in. He did not look surprised. "Sit down, Eleanor," he said. "I'll stand," she said. His eyes narrowed slightly. I know what Doyle told you. She stayed by the door, not because she was afraid of him, but because she needed the space between them right now. "I want to talk about the deed." A pause, the kind of pause that confirmed something. "There are questions," he said carefully, "about the paperwork on the original Dawson Creek sale. Whether the previous owner had clear title at the time he sold." "That's not true," Eleanor said. "The title is clean." "You know it's clean. You looked into that property before Silas Boone bought it, which means your lawyers already looked at the deed." She kept her voice steady. "You are manufacturing a problem that does not exist." He held her gaze. "I'm protecting this family," he said. "From what?" She said it quietly. "From a man who is repairing a fence? From someone who is building something honestly, on land he purchased honestly, with money he earned honestly?" She took one step forward. "From the fact that I find more worth in an afternoon on that ranch than I have found in 5 years of doing what was expected of me." "Eleanor." "He turned down $1,200, she said. "He stood at that gate and looked at your money and said no." "Do you know how rarely a man does that? A man with nothing?" "A man with nothing is exactly the point," Augustus said sharply. "You are my daughter. I deserve to choose," she said. "That's all I'm asking for. Not your blessing, not your approval. Just the freedom to make my own decision without you calling in favors with the county clerk to destroy a man who has done nothing wrong." The room was very quiet. Augustus looked at her for a long moment. She could see something working behind his eyes, the machinery of a man who had gotten his way through force of will for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely opposed. "If I withdraw the inquiry," he said finally, slowly, "you will be inviting a situation that I cannot." "If you withdraw the inquiry," she said, "I will come home for supper on Sundays." It was not a bargain. It was a boundary. She could hear the difference in her own voice, and she was surprised by it, by the steadiness of it, by the fact that her hands were not shaking. Augustus said nothing for a long time. "Go to bed, Eleanor," he said finally. It was not a withdrawal, but it was not an escalation either. She went to bed. She lay awake most of the night. In the morning, the inquiry at the county clerk's office had not been withdrawn. But it had not advanced either, and Silas, when she arrived at the ranch the next afternoon, had received no further communication about it. She did not tell him about the conversation with her father. Some things needed to work themselves out in the dark before they were ready for daylight. Instead, she arrived to find Silas on the roof of the barn. Not the roof of the house, the barn, which was considerably higher and considerably more precarious, the old timber showing its years, the pitch steep enough that every movement required care. He had a hammer in his hand and a mouthful of nails, which was a habit she had already decided was going to be the death of him, and he was replacing a section of damaged roofing that she had flagged in her assessment 2 weeks ago. "You should have waited for another pair of hands," she called up. He took the nails out of his mouth. "I've been doing roofs alone since I was 17. "That is not the reassurance you think it is," she said. He almost smiled at that. She had noticed he did that, not quite smiled, held it just short of a smile, like a man who had learned early that full expressions were a kind of exposure. "Hand me that pry bar," he said. She handed it up to him. "The inquiry hasn't moved," she told him, keeping her voice even. He looked down at her. Something shifted in his face. "You talk to him. I talk to my father regularly." "It's a habit, Eleanor. The situation is not resolved," she said. "But it is not actively moving against you. I think that's where we are for now." He was quiet for a moment, prying up a damaged section of roofing. The wood came away with a sound that was almost a sigh. "I don't need you fighting my battles," he said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I'm fighting my own." She picked up a handful of replacement shingles and held them up to him. "Are you going to argue about it, or are we going to fix this roof?" He took the shingles. They fixed the roof. It took the rest of that day and most of the following morning, and by the time they had finished, Silas's arms were aching, and Eleanor had a blister on her palm from the hammer that she refused to acknowledge. They sat on the ridge of the completed section in the early afternoon, looking out over the valley, and the barn beneath them no longer leaked, which was the kind of accomplishment that felt simple from the outside and enormous from the inside. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said. He looked at her, surprised by the directness. "That's a peculiar request," he said. "I know." She was looking at the valley, not at him. "We've been talking for weeks, and everything we say to each other is practical. Fence posts, soil. I want to know something real." He was quiet for a while. She did not push. "I was afraid of this place," he said finally. "When I first bought it. I walked the property line that first morning, and I was genuinely afraid I had made the worst decision of my life." He paused. "I never told anyone that. I let everyone think I was certain. But I wasn't. I was terrified." She turned and looked at him. "What changed?" she said. "I got up anyway, a beat. Fear and action can exist at the same time. I had to learn that. You can be scared down to your boots and still pick up the hammer." She was quiet. "Your turn," he said. She turned back to the valley. "I came here the first day, hoping you would take the money," she said. "My father asked me to deliver that letter because he knew you'd be less likely to argue with me than with Doyle. He used me to make it gentler." A pause. "I let him. I told myself I was being helpful, but I was being obedient, which is different." She said the last part very quietly. "I've spent most of my life confusing those two things." He said nothing. She was glad he said nothing, because the wrong response would have ruined it. He just sat with what she'd said, the way a person sits with something true and difficult, giving it space to be what it was. "And then you threw the money in the dirt," she said. "And I thought, here is a man who is not confused about that particular distinction." "I didn't actually throw it in the dirt," he said. "You held it out like it was something unpleasant. There's a difference." "There is not much of one," she said, and this time he did smile, the full version, and it rearranged his face into something she had not expected, younger somehow, unguarded, and she felt something move in her chest that she was not prepared for. She looked back at the valley. The moment passed, but it stayed with her, the way certain moments do, pressing against the inside of things. It was 4 days after the roof that the situation changed again. Silas had ridden into Miller's Crossing for supplies, a trip he made every couple of weeks, keeping it brief and businesslike, nodding to the people he passed without inviting conversation. He had made his peace with the town's opinion of him. It was not a particularly warm peace, but it was a functional one. He was loading sacks of grain into his wagon when he heard his name. Not spoken to him, spoken about him, he went still. 3 men were standing outside the saloon across the street, not ranch hands, not workers, but the particular kind of idle man who spent most of his time in saloons, specifically because he had nothing more productive to do. Silas recognized 2 of them vaguely, minor associates of Caldwell's, the kind of men who inflated their importance by proximity to someone powerful. He could not hear all of it. He heard enough. He heard Eleanor's name. He heard the word for her body used the way those men meant it, as a punchline rather than a description. And there was laughter. The sharp, mean kind, the kind that is designed to carry. And then more words that he could not quite make out, but did not need to, because the tone said everything. He set down the grain sack. He crossed the street. The 3 men saw him coming, and the laughter stopped. One of them, the one who had been talking, had the decency to look uncertain, though not enough decency to have not said the thing in the first place. Silas stopped in front of them. He was not a large man, not the way Augustus Caldwell was large, or the way Doyle was large. He was lean and weathered, and his hands were the most notable thing about him physically, the size and capability of them. He looked at the man who had been talking and said nothing for a moment. The man shifted his weight. "Boone, we weren't. I heard what you were," Silas said. His voice was very quiet. "I'm going to say one thing to you, and I need you to hear it clearly." He let the silence sit for a second. "Eleanor Caldwell is one of the finest people in this territory. She has more understanding of real work and real land than you will accumulate in your entire life. You want to mock something, mock your own choices. Leave her out of your mouth." The man stared at him. "You sweet on the Caldwell girl?" one of the others said. Not aggressively, just genuinely surprised. "That," Silas said, "is not your business." He held the first man's gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked back to his wagon. His hands were shaking when he got there. Not from fear. From the particular kind of anger that comes from hearing something you knew existed, but hadn't yet had to witness, directly knowing that Eleanor had grown up navigating that, had learned to hold herself that way, not by choice but by necessity. Had built that composure the way a person builds armor, piece by piece, because the alternative was to be unprotected. He loaded the rest of the grain. He drove back to the ranch. He did not tell Eleanor what had happened in town. But something had shifted in him, settled like a post driven deep into solid ground. He had known for weeks what he was beginning to feel. He had been managing it with the same practicals he applied to everything else, acknowledging it the way you acknowledge a problem you cannot address immediately, noting its presence. Setting it aside, attending to it when the moment was right. The moment he was beginning to understand did not arrange itself. You had to recognize it. She arrived the next afternoon to find him working on the water trough behind the barn, a structural problem she had identified early on, a crack in the base that was causing slow seepage. Losing water in a way that would matter a great deal come summer. It was painstaking work, requiring a specific mixture of materials that he had been researching since she flagged it, and he had made a small mathematical error in his first calculation that she found within 5 minutes of looking at his notes. "Here," she said, pointing to the figure. He looked. He had multiplied when he should have divided. "I see it," he said. "The ratio is wrong. You'd have ended up with something too thin to hold." "I know, Eleanor. I'm just saying." "I know," he said, and the edge in his voice was not irritation at her, and she seemed to understand that, because she did not bristle. She just waited. He set down his pencil. "Some men in town said something about you yesterday," he said. "I confronted them about it." He kept his eyes on the trough calculation. "I wanted you to know, in case it comes back around to you some other way." She was very still. "What did they say?" she asked. "Nothing worth repeating. Silas, nothing that hasn't been said before, and nothing that deserves the dignity of repetition." He looked at her then. "I just wanted you to know that it was said in front of me, and I didn't let it stand." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not surprise, which told him everything about how many times this had happened in her life, but something else. Something that was harder to name and harder to look at directly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You don't need to thank me for basic decency." "I know," she said, "but I'm thanking you anyway, because it isn't as common as it should be." She paused. "What did they say when you confronted them?" "One of them asked if I was sweet on you." A beat. "What did you say?" she asked. He picked up his pencil. "I said it wasn't their business," he said. The silence that followed was the particular kind that is not empty but full. Full of things that have been observed but not yet spoken. Full of the awareness that something is approaching that neither person is quite ready to name. Eleanor looked down at the calculation. "The correct ratio," she said, "is 3-1. "I know," he said. "Then fix it." He fixed it. 3 days later, the second twist arrived, and it came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. It came from town the way trouble often did, but not in the form of men outside saloons or county clerk inquiries. It came in the form of a woman named Margaret Hale, who was the wife of the county commissioner, and the most effective social force in Miller's Crossing by a considerable margin. Margaret Hale had opinions about everything, and the connections to make those opinions consequential, and she had apparently decided that Eleanor Caldwell's repeated visits to the Dawson Creek Ranch were a matter of community concern. Silas heard about it from the boy at the telegraph office, who was turning into a reliable, if unofficial, source of local intelligence. The telegraph was brief. Mrs. Hale had paid a call on Augustus Caldwell that morning. She had, by all accounts, expressed significant concern about the reputation implications of his daughter's behavior. She had used the word reputation several times. She had also used the word appropriate and the phrase her situation in life, which everyone who knew Margaret Hale understood to mean the same thing everyone in town meant when they looked at Eleanor and made their calculations. Her size, her unmarried state, the assumption that a woman of her appearance had limited options and should not risk the few she had on a man like Silas Boone. Silas stood with the telegraph in his hand for a long time. Then Eleanor arrived at the gate, and he could see from the set of her shoulders before she even dismounted that she already knew. She tied the mare and walked up to him. "Mrs. Hale," she said. "I heard. She told my father I was embarrassing myself." Her voice was controlled, but something in it was pulled very tight, like fence wire under too much tension. "She said that a woman in my position cannot afford to be seen pursuing a man who, and I am quoting, has no future to offer." Silas said nothing. "She also implied," Eleanor continued, "that you were taking advantage of my loneliness. That you were cultivating my presence here because my family connections were useful to you." She stopped walking. "I want you to know that I told my father that was ridiculous." "What did your father say?" She looked at him steadily. "He said he wasn't sure it was." The words landed the way quiet words sometimes do, harder than shouting. Silas absorbed it. "Eleanor," he said. "I know what this is," she said quickly, not giving him the chance to say something careful or kind or distancing. "I know what I've been doing here. I know it started as something practical, and I know it changed." Her voice did not waver. "And I know that Margaret Hale's version of my situation, the one where I am desperate and you are opportunistic, is a lie. I know my own mind," she looked at him, "but I need to know yours." He looked at her. He thought about 11 years of saving. About the way he had walked this property in the dark, before anyone could see his face. About the telegraph in his pocket and the men outside the saloon, and the way she had stood beside him at the gate instead of behind him. He thought about what it meant to be a man who had spent his whole life working on other people's land and finally having something of his own. He thought about Eleanor Caldwell in the evening light on the fence rail, laughing, unguarded, returned to herself for just one moment. "What you are seeing in me," he said slowly, "is not opportunity. What you are seeing is a man who has not let himself want much for a long time because wanting things that were out of reach was a habit he could not afford." He stopped. Started again. "I am not a man who makes speeches. But I will tell you plainly that the days you are here are different from the days you are not. And it is not because of what you know about fence posts." She was very still. "That's enough," she said softly. It is," she said. "For now it is." They stood there at the gate in the afternoon quiet, not touching, not making promises, not resolving anything. Just two people who had said something true to each other and were letting it exist in the air between them. Then Eleanor straightened. "My father is coming tomorrow," she said. "He told me this morning. He wants to speak to you directly." Silas nodded. He had expected this. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He thought about the morning he had first walked this land. About the fear he had kept to himself, that he had gotten up and moved through anyway. "No," he said. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." She went to work. He stood at the gate a moment longer, looking north toward the Caldwell property, toward the land that Augustus had spent 30 years accumulating, toward everything that stood between this broken ranch and the thing it was slowly becoming. Then he turned back to his own land. There was still work to do. He did it. Augustus Caldwell arrived the following morning, just after 7, which told Silas something about the man's character. He came early, when a man was still in his working clothes, before anyone had time to prepare. He came alone, which told Silas something else. No Doyle. No lawyers, no ranch hands for implied intimidation. Just Augustus and his horse and the morning light. Silas was at the water trough, finishing the repair. He heard the horse on the road, heard it slow and stop at the gate. He straightened and turned around. Augustus Caldwell looked at the ranch. He really looked at it, not the dismissive scan of a man who had already made his judgment, but the careful, thorough assessment of someone who understood land and knew what they were seeing. He looked at the fence line, the new posts, and the repaired wire. He looked at the fields where the brush had been cleared and the soil turned. He looked at the barn with its new roof section, the fresh timber bright against the weathered old boards. He dismounted. He walked to the trough where Silas was standing, and he looked at the repair work, the careful patching of the crack, the new sealant compound Silas had mixed at Eleanor's corrected ratio. "This is good work," Augustus said. It was not what Silas expected. "Thank you," Silas said carefully. Augustus walked past the trough and toward the barn. He stopped at the door and looked inside, at the repaired frame, the cleaned interior, the organized equipment. He said nothing for a moment, then he turned around. "My daughter," he said, "has been working alongside you on this property." "She has," Silas said. "She knows her business. She has improved the result." "I'm aware that she knows her business," Augustus said, and there was something complicated in his voice, pride and frustration wound together. The tone of a man who had taught someone everything, and then watched that knowledge be applied in ways he had not intended. That was never the question. He looked at Silas directly. "The question is your intentions." Silas met his gaze. "Toward the ranch or toward your daughter?" "Both." "Toward the ranch, to build it into a working cattle property, honest income, sustainable operation, within 3 years." Toward Eleanor he stopped himself. He took a breath. He would not dress this up. "I am not going to pretend to you that what I feel is only neighborly. That would be a lie, and I don't think you're a man who respects a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth." Augustus was very still. "She is my daughter," he said. It came out of him differently than anything else he had said, not the voice of the powerful rancher, not the authority of a man who controlled 30,000 acres, but the voice of a father. "Simple and exposed, I know that," Silas said. Augustus stopped. His jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the mountains. "She has had a difficult time. People have not been kind. I have tried to protect her from that." "I know you have," Silas said. "You think I've done it wrong." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that a person can be loved very well and still be protected from the wrong things." He paused. "She doesn't need protection from difficulty. She's already handled more difficulty than most people ever will. What she needs is—" He stopped, aware he was on the edge of something that was not his territory to define. But Augustus was looking at him, waiting. Someone who sees her first, Silas said simply. Before anything else, before any calculations about what she represents or what she looks like or what she's worth to anybody. Just her. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Augustus turned back to face him. His expression was not soft. It was the expression of a man working through something very hard, something that had required giving up a position he had held for a very long time. You have nothing, Augustus said. I have this ranch, Silas said. I have my word, I have my work. He looked the older man in the eye. A man who has those three things has enough to begin. Augustus looked at the ranch again. All of it. The whole broken, repairing, slowly becoming thing. Then he looked at Silas. I'm not giving you my blessing, he said. I didn't ask for it, Silas said. I know you didn't. Something moved across Augustus's face. Not surrender, not approval. Something more like the first distant acknowledgement of a truth he had not yet finished fighting. That's the first thing you've done, that I respect. He mounted his horse, he rode north. Silas stood in the yard watching him go. He did not know what had just happened, not entirely, not yet. He knew it was not the end. He knew Augustus Caldwell had not ridden 30 years to his position to give up a single morning conversation. He knew there were harder days ahead than any of the days that had already come. But he also knew that a man who says the first thing you've done that I respect is a man who has begun to look. And a man who has begun to look can eventually learn to see. He went back to the trough. He finished the repair. He was pressing his palm flat against the sealed surface, testing it, feeling for weakness, when he heard the mare coming down the road from the north. He did not look up, Eleanor said. He did. She dismounted and came to stand beside the trough. She looked at the repair. She pressed her own palm against it. Good, she said. Good, he agreed. She looked at him sideways. What did he say? He said, I have nothing. What did you say? I said, I have enough to begin. She was quiet for a moment, her hand still against the sealed trough, both of them feeling for weakness, for the places that might fail under pressure. Neither of them found any. He'll come back, she said. I know, it might be worse next time. Or better, he said. She turned and looked at him fully, and in the morning light her face was open in a way it rarely was, the composure set aside, and what was underneath it was something that he recognized, because he had been carrying the same thing for weeks now. That particular expression of a person standing at the edge of something enormous and not stepping back. I know, he said. She nodded once. Then she picked up a shovel. The east field isn't going to clear itself, she said. He picked up his own. They walked out to the east field together, and the morning opened around them, bright and cold and full of work, and neither of them said another word, because there was nothing left to say that the work wasn't already saying for them. The east field took them 4 days to clear, 4 days of pulling brush, turning soil, hauling deadwood to the burn pile at the edge of the property. Working from early light until the sun dropped behind the mountains and the cold came back into the air, with a sharpness that reminded them both that Wyoming's version of autumn was brief and Wyoming's version of winter had no patience for unfinished work. They did not talk much during those 4 days. They did not need to. Something had settled between them after Augustus's visit, after the conversation at the trough, after Eleanor had picked up the shovel and walked into the field without waiting to be asked. It was not resolution, it was not certainty. It was something quieter than both of those things, a shared understanding that they were moving toward something neither of them was going to name until the ground beneath it was solid enough to hold the weight of the naming. On the 5th morning, Eleanor did not come. Silas noticed it the way you notice weather, not immediately, not with alarm, but with a growing awareness that the conditions had changed. He worked through the morning on the barn's interior framing, the next major project on his list, the structural repairs that needed to happen before he could consider bringing in any livestock. He worked and he listened, and the road from the north stayed empty. By noon he had decided he was not going to think about it. By mid-afternoon he had decided he was not thinking about it quite frequently. He was halfway through replacing a damaged support beam when he heard hoofbeats on the road. And the relief that moved through him before he had consciously processed what the sound meant told him something important about how far past practical this had already gone. But it was not Eleanor, it was Doyle. The Caldwell foreman came alone this time, without the two hands who had accompanied him on his last visit. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at the barn where Silas was working and called out without dismounting, which was deliberate. The distance was a message, the refusal to come to the door a statement about what kind of visit this was. Mr. Boone Silas set down his tools and walked to the gate. "Doyle," he said. "Miss Eleanor is unwell," Doyle said. His voice was flat, professional, delivering information the way a man delivers news he was told to deliver, and nothing more. "She won't be coming by for some time. Mr. Caldwell asked me to let you know." Silas looked at him. "Unwell," he said. "That's right." "What kind of unwell?" Doyle's jaw moved. "The kind that keeps a person home," he said. The flatness of it, the deliberate emptiness of the answer, told Silas everything the answer had been designed to conceal. Eleanor was not ill, Eleanor was being kept. "I'd like to send a message to her," Silas said. "Through you, if you're willing." Doyle shook his head once. "Not my business to carry personal messages, Mr. Boone." "Then not your business to come here delivering them either," Silas said, and his voice was still even, still controlled, but there was something underneath it that Doyle heard, because the foreman's horse shifted, and Doyle steadied it with a hand. "I'm doing my job," Doyle said. "I know you are," Silas said. "Go on and do it somewhere else." Doyle looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back north. Silas stood at the gate. He stood there for longer than he needed to, his hands on the top rail, looking north at the road that ran toward the Caldwell property, toward 30,000 acres, and a man who believed that love and control were the same instrument. He thought about Eleanor lying awake in that house, which he was certain she was doing, because it was what he would be doing in the same situation. He thought about her hands on the trough repair, testing for weakness. He thought about the east field they had cleared together, 4 days of work that was now sitting there in the sharp autumn air, turned and ready, waiting for something to be planted in it. He went back to the barn, he picked up his tools, he worked until dark. He was back at it before sunrise. The week that followed was the hardest week he had spent at Dawson Creek, which was saying something, because the early weeks had been objectively more brutal, more physical labor. More uncertainty about the basic viability of what he was doing, less visible progress. But those weeks had not had this particular quality of absence. He had been alone before. He had been comfortable with aloneness, had cultivated it, had built a life around the assumption that it was simply his condition. He had not understood until now what the difference was between solitude chosen and solitude imposed. Between being alone because you had not yet found what you were looking for, and being alone because what you were looking for had been deliberately removed from your reach. He worked harder to fill the space. He finished the barn framing. He started on the hayloft repairs. He mended the remaining fence sections on the northern boundary, the ones he had been postponing because they required working closest to the Caldwell property line, and he had not wanted to create unnecessary provocation. He postponed that concern now. He worked the northern fence the way he worked everything else methodically, one post at a time, one section at a time, not looking toward Caldwell land more than once or twice per hour. Perhaps 3 or 4 times. On the 8th day he found a note tucked under his gate. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper, left there sometime before he rose, which meant whoever left it had come in the dark. He unfolded it and read it standing at the gate in the early light. The handwriting was Eleanor's. He knew it from the notes she had made in his ranch journal, the careful, precise script of someone who had taught herself to write legibly, because she took the communication of accurate information seriously. The note said, "I am fine, he is not angry, only worried. Do not do anything that will make this harder. I am working on it." 3 sentences. He read them 4 times. Then he folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He spent the rest of that morning feeling something he could not entirely name relief, yes, but also something more complicated. Something that had to do with the phrase working on it, with the image of Eleanor in that house doing whatever quiet, methodical, Eleanor-shaped thing she was doing to address the situation. She was not waiting to be rescued. She had never been waiting to be rescued. She was handling it the way she handled everything directly, practically, and on her own terms. He trusted that. He went back to work. It was on the 11th day that the shift happened, and it came from the least expected direction. Silas was in Miller's Crossing, his regular supply run, moving through his list efficiently, with the intention of being back on the property before noon. He was at the hardware store when he became aware of a particular quality of quiet that falls over a room when something is about to be said that nobody wants to say first. He turned around. 3 men were standing in the doorway of the hardware store. Not the saloon men from before. These were working ranchers, the Haverford brothers, who ran a modest cattle operation on the south end of the valley, and a third man named Pierce, whose family had been in Carbon County since before it was Carbon County. Men he had nodded to. Men who had watched him ride through town for months with the careful neutrality of people who had not yet decided what they thought. The older Haverford, whose name was Gus, took his hat off. "That was the first strange thing, Mr. Boone," Gus Haverford said. "We were hoping to find you." Silas set down the bolt he had been examining. "You found me," he said. Gus turned his hat in his hands. He was a man about 60, large and weathered, with the particular discomfort of someone who was going to say something difficult and knew it, and was going to say it anyway. "We've been watching what you've done with Dawson Creek," he said. "Most people have been watching," Silas said. "Most people were watching to see you fail," Gus said bluntly. "I want to be honest about that," he paused. "We weren't, exactly. But we didn't step in to help either, and we could have. And that's something I've been sitting with." He looked up from his hat. "Caldwell has had this valley running the way he wants it to run for 30 years. He's not a bad man, I want to be clear about that. But he's a man who's used to arranging things, and when he decides something shouldn't happen, it generally doesn't." Silas said nothing. He was listening. "Miss Eleanor has come to our property twice in the past week," Gus said. "My wife and Eleanor's mother were friends years ago before Eleanor's mother passed. Eleanor knows she's welcome with us." He paused again. "She is not being held prisoner, if that's what you're thinking. Caldwell is not that kind of man, but there is a significant pressure on her. He has brought in a man from Laramie, a gentleman of some financial standing." "There is," Silas said. The word came out before he intended it, sharper than he intended it. Gus looked at him carefully. "A man named Whitmore. Franklin Whitmore. He owns 3 properties in Albany County. He has expressed an interest in Miss Eleanor." The hardware store was very quiet. Silas picked up the bolt. "He set it back down," he said. His voice was level. He made it level the same way he made fence posts level, by force and precision, and refusing to let the ground's natural slope dictate the outcome. "She is," Gus said, "which is why she came to my wife. She asked my wife to get a message to you." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Silas took it. He read it. 3 sentences again. Eleanor was efficient with words the way she was efficient with everything else. The note said, "His name is Franklin Whitmore. My father has invited him to dinner Friday. I have not agreed to anything, and I will not, but I need you to trust me, and I need you to wait." He folded the paper. He looked at Gus Haverford. "Thank you," he said. "Is there anything we can?" "Not yet," Silas said. "But I appreciate you telling me." He picked up his supply list. "I'm going to finish my errands." He finished his errands. He rode home with the supplies. He unloaded everything, put it away, did it all in the correct order, methodically, one item at a time, because the alternative was to stand in the yard and feel the full weight of what he was feeling, and that was not going to help anyone. Then he sat on the porch in the cold afternoon air, and he thought about Eleanor Caldwell, in that house, with a man named Franklin Whitmore coming to dinner on Friday, and he thought about trust. He was not a man who trusted easily. He had not been raised in conditions that made trust a natural instinct. He had learned, through long experience, that people's stated intentions and their actual behavior were two different things, and that the gap between those two things was where most of the damage in a person's life happened. But Eleanor had never given him any gap to measure. Every single thing she had said to him, she had then done. Every fact she had given him had proven correct. Every judgment she had offered had been sound. She had said she was working on it, and she was working on it. She had said she would not agree to anything, and he believed her. Trust, he thought, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act on what a person had shown you, rather than what your fear was telling you. He trusted Eleanor. He waited. Friday came and went. He did not hear anything. Saturday came and went. He worked the northern fence. He did not look toward Caldwell land more than twice per hour. Perhaps 3 times. Sunday morning at first light he heard hoofbeats. He was up already. He was always up before light, and he was at the gate before she reached it, which he recognized, even in the moment, as embarrassing in the way that only honest things are embarrassing. Eleanor pulled the mare up at the gate and dismounted in one smooth motion, and looked at him, and something in her face told him before she opened her mouth that Friday had gone a particular way. "Well," he said. "Franklin Whitmore," she said, "is a perfectly pleasant man who is primarily interested in my father's grazing rights and my father's business connections, and has been politely and clearly informed that I am unavailable." She held Silas's gaze. He took it well. He had a very nice supper and rode home to Laramie on Saturday morning. Silas let out a breath. "And your father," he said. Her expression shifted. Not defeat. Something more complex than defeat. "My father," she said, "sat across the table from me Friday night and watched me tell a perfectly wealthy, perfectly acceptable man that I was unavailable. And then he asked me, very quietly, if I understood what I was giving up." She paused. "And I told him that I did, and that I was giving it up without hesitation." "What did he say to that?" "He said nothing," she said. "Which from my father," as she stopped. "He didn't argue. He didn't make threats. He just sat there and looked at me for a long time, and then he said good night and went to bed." She looked at Silas steadily. "Something is changing in him. I can feel it. It isn't resolved. But something is shifting." Silas looked at her. "You should know," he said, "that the 11 days you were not here were the longest 11 days I have had since I started at Dawson Creek." She looked back at him. "Good," she said. "They were not comfortable for me either." He almost smiled. "Come look at the barn," he said. "The framing is done." She came and looked at the barn. She had precise and accurate opinions about the framing, several of which required him to make adjustments, all of which made the result better. This was the pattern of them, and he understood now that it was not going to change and did not want it to. They were deep in an argument about the most efficient load distribution for the new hayloft floor, when Silas heard something that pulled him out of the conversation entirely. He stopped mid-sentence. Eleanor heard it too. They both looked north. The sky in the direction of the Caldwell property had changed. The particular quality of the light was wrong, and there was something in the air that was not weather, a smell, a heat, a quality of the wind that anyone who had ever lived on a ranch in dry summer country recognized in their bones before their conscious mind caught up. "Smoke. That's not a burn pile," Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. Silas was already moving. He was at the barn before she finished the sentence, pulling his horse from the stall, throwing the saddle on with the speed of a man who had done it 10,000 times and did not need to think about the sequence. His hands were working faster than his brain, which was occupied with the smell of the smoke and the direction of the wind and the position of the sun, and all the calculations that a man makes in the first 20 seconds after fire becomes a real possibility. "Stay here," he said. "Absolutely not," Eleanor said. She was already at the gate, already untying her mare. "Eleanor, that is my father's property," she said. "Do not tell me to stay here." He did not tell her again. They rode north. The fire was visible before they reached the Caldwell property line, not the house, not the main structures, but the great livestock barn to the east of the main compound, the one that housed Caldwell's prize horses, the ones he had built his reputation on over 30 years of careful breeding. The fire had gotten into the hayloft first, which was how barn fires always went, and it had moved fast, the way hay fires moved, with a speed and intensity that turned a controllable situation into a crisis it took to run from one end of the property to the other. Men were already at work when Silas and Eleanor arrived Caldwell's hands, forming bucket lines, throwing water at the base of the fire with the desperate, systematic inefficiency of people who are working as hard as they possibly can and know it will not be enough. Silas counted the horses in the yard. He counted the stalls he could see through the open barn door, the ones not yet fully involved. He made the calculation in 3 seconds. "How many still inside?" he shouted to the nearest ranch hand. The man held up 4 fingers. Silas was off his horse before he had consciously decided to dismount. "Boone," Eleanor's voice, sharp and frightened and furious all at once. He went into the barn. The heat hit him like a wall, not the ambient warmth of a barn in summer, but a density of heat pressed against his skin and pushed into his lungs with every breath. He could hear the fire above him in the hayloft, the particular cracking and groaning of timber under that kind of assault, and he knew without calculating it that he had a limited amount of time before the structural situation became irreversible. He found the first horse in the second stall, a bay mare that had pressed herself into the far corner and was beyond panic, beyond the usual flight response, locked into the rigid stillness of an animal that had run out of options. He got the stall open, got his hands on her halter, talked low and steady the way he had always talked to frightened animals, the same tone regardless of the situation, calm and present and certain, even when he was none of those things. "Easy, easy, I've come on now." The mare came. He got her to the door, released her into the hands of a ranch hand waiting outside, went back in. The second horse was harder, a stallion that Augustus had paid significant money for, an animal with a justified reputation for being difficult under normal circumstances and who was not, in the current circumstances, remotely cooperative. Silas spent 45 seconds in the stallion's stall that felt considerably longer, managing 1,200 pounds of terrified horse with 2 hands and his voice and the specific patient, unrelenting pressure that was the only thing that worked with an animal who had decided not to trust you. The stallion came. The heat when he went back in for the 3rd time was noticeably worse. He heard something shift in the hayloft above him, not the gradual process of burning timber, but the abrupt mechanical sound of a structural element giving way, and he moved faster. Third horse, a young gelding barely 2 years old, quivering in his stall. Easy to lead. Out in 30 seconds he went back in. The 4th stall was at the far end of the barn. He was aware, moving toward it, that the situation above him had changed significantly in the time he had been going in and out. The smoke was lower, the temperature was higher, the structural sounds were more frequent and less predictable. He was running a calculation in his head that he did not want to finish because the answer it was arriving at was uncomfortable. He got the 4th horse out. He was 3 steps from the barn door, the horse moving ahead of him, when something gave way above with a sound like a rifle shot, and a section of the hayloft came down. Not where he was standing, close to where he was standing. He threw himself forward and felt rather than saw the burning timber hit the ground behind him, felt the heat wave of it, felt the physical displacement of air. And then he was through the door and into the comparative cold of the yard, and someone was grabbing him by the arm and pulling him further from the building. He blinked. Eleanor was the one holding his arm. Her face was white. She stopped. "Started again. Are you hurt?" He took inventory. His coat sleeve was scorched along the left arm. His lungs hurt. His hands were burned at the palms, not severely, but enough that he would know about it for several days. "I'm all right," he said. "You are not all right," she said, and her voice was doing something he had never heard it do before it was not controlled. The composure she wore like a second skin had cracked entirely, and what was underneath it was fear, the real kind, undisguised, unmistakable. "You went in 4 times. 4. Do you understand what could have—" She stopped herself. I understand, he said. The horses are not worth your life, she said. They're not dead, he said. Eleanor. He turned to look at her fully, and he knew his face was covered in soot, and he was still breathing too hard, and his hands were hurting, but he looked at her and said, I'm here. I'm standing in front of you, I'm here. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something that surprised him. She put her hand flat on his chest, over his heart, and held it there. Just that, not an embrace, not a declaration, just her hand feeling what was underneath. He stayed very still. He could feel his own heartbeat in his palms where they were burned. 4 times, she said softly, not to him, almost to herself. I couldn't leave them, he said. She looked up at him. I know, she said. That's the thing about you, Silas Boone. You can't leave anything behind that still has life in it. She held his gaze. Do you understand what that means to someone who has spent her whole life being treated as something that should be left behind? He did not have an answer for that. He did not think an answer was what she was asking for. She took her hand off his chest. She stepped back. And that was the moment Augustus Caldwell walked up behind them. Neither of them had heard him coming. Neither of them had been paying attention to anything except each other, and now Augustus was standing 6 feet away, and he had clearly arrived in time to see the last of it, his daughter's hand on Silas's chest. The two of them looking at each other, the way they were looking at each other. Silas met Augustus's eyes. He did not step back. He did not adjust his posture. He did not perform innocence or distance or any of the things a man performs when he has been caught in a moment and wants to minimize what it was. Augustus looked at him. Then he looked at his barn, still burning, still being worked by his men with buckets and water in desperation. He looked at the 4 horses standing in the yard, all alive, all accounted for, all saved. He looked back at Silas. His face was doing something complicated. Those horses, he said, and his voice was rougher than Silas had ever heard it, represent 30 years of breeding. A pause. I was told you went in 4 times. The 4th one almost got away from me, Silas said. Augustus's jaw moved. He looked at Silas' burned hands. He looked at the scorched sleeve. Then, and this was the thing that Silas would remember later, when he tried to identify the moment that changed the weight of this whole long effort, Augustus Caldwell, the most powerful man in Carbon County. A man who had run his valley like a careful clockmaker for 3 decades, looked down at the ground. Not in defeat, not in embarrassment. In the particular way that a strong man looks at the ground when he is acknowledging that he has been wrong about something, and the acknowledgement is too large and too honest to look anyone in the face while making it. I tried to have your deed questioned, Augustus said. I know, Silas said. I sent Doyle to tell Eleanor you weren't to be. He stopped. I know that too, Silas said. I brought Whitmore here specifically. Yes, Silas said. Augustus was quiet. I want you to know, Silas said, and he kept his voice even, not cold, not angry, just steady, that I understand why you did all of those things. I understand a man protecting what matters to him. I would not have done it that way, but I understand it. Augustus looked up. You're not going to leave, he said. It was not a question. No, sir, Silas said, even if I make it harder. You can make it considerably harder than you have, Silas said. And I'll still be here working that fence line on the other side of your morning. Something passed through Augustus Caldwell's face that Silas could not fully read. Too many layers to it, too much compressed into too small a space. It was the face of a man who had spent 30 years winning and had arrived, for the first time, at the edge of something he could not win his way through. And then, before anyone could say another word, one of the Caldwell ranch hands shouted from the south end of the barn, a different shout, not panic, but urgent, the voice of a man who has found a problem that needs immediate attention. The fire had jumped. A burning piece of roof material had carried on the wind and landed in the dry grass between the main barn and the secondary equipment shed, and that grass had caught, and the line of fire was moving toward the shed with a speed that meant they had perhaps 4 minutes before the shed was involved, and the shed sat directly adjacent to the main grain storage. If the grain storage went, the Caldwell opera lost wind supply for its entire herd. Silas looked at the situation. He looked at his burned hands. He picked up a shovel. He moved toward the fire line. He was not alone. Beside him, also with a shovel, also moving toward the fire line, was Eleanor. And behind her, after a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, also with a shovel, moving alongside his men, was Augustus Caldwell. They cut the fire line together, 3 people and the ranch hands, working a trench in the dry ground, throwing dirt on the leading edge of the grass fire, working fast and systematically. And it was Eleanor who identified the right angle for the trench, and Silas who moved the men to the correct position along it, and Augustus who worked beside them without directing, without asserting authority, just working, a man among men, with his hands in the dirt and the smoke in his face. They stopped it. Barely, but they stopped it. When it was done, when the last of the fire line was cold and the immediate danger was past, they stood in a ragged line, all of them breathing hard, covered in ash and sweat and dirt. And the silence between them was the particular silence of people who have just done something hard together and have not yet found the words for what it means. Augustus looked at the trench they had cut. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Silas. "Character," he said quietly. Silas blinked. "I said to you, the first time we spoke," Augustus continued, and his voice had a different quality now, scraped clean by the evening, by the fire, by everything, that determination doesn't create a future. He stopped. "You said character does, I remember," Silas said. Augustus looked at his burned hands. Then he looked at his own. "You went into a burning barn," he said slowly, "for horses belonging to a man who had been trying to run you out of the valley." He let that sit for a moment. "You didn't think about it. You didn't negotiate it. You just did it." He looked at Silas directly. "That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Everything I should have understood months ago." Eleanor had gone very still beside Silas. "I wasn't doing it to prove anything to you," Silas said. "I know," Augustus said. "That's what makes it proof." The words landed quietly, the way important things sometimes do, not with the drama of a declaration, but with the simple weight of a truth that has finally found its right moment. The moon was up now, the fire in the barn reduced to embers under the continuing work of the bucket line, the shed and grain storage standing unburned, the 4 horses safe in the yard. Augustus put his hand on Silas's shoulder, not an embrace. Not a performance, just the hand of a man who had made a decision about another man, and was communicating it in the way that men in that time and place communicated the things that mattered most simply, directly, and without the requirement of more words than were necessary. "You should have that hand looked at," Augustus said, nodding at the burned palm. "It's not bad," Silas said. "Eleanor will look at it," Augustus said. He turned and walked toward the house. Eleanor watched her father go. She turned to Silas. He held out his left hand, palm up. "Well," he said. She looked at it carefully. She turned it gently in both of hers, examining the burn, and her hands were steadier than they had been earlier, but not entirely steady, and he could feel the slight tremble in them through his own skin. "It needs to be cleaned," she said, "and wrapped." "I know," he said. "Come to the house." He followed her to the house. He sat at the kitchen table of the Caldwell property for the first time, in the warmth of the kitchen, while Eleanor cleaned and wrapped his burns with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. And outside, the ranch hands finished the work of securing the barn site, and somewhere in the back of the house Augustus Caldwell was doing whatever a man does with a conviction he has held for 30 years, when the ground shouts out from under it. "Your father said." "I know," Eleanor said. She was focused on his hand. "Something changed tonight." "Something has been changing for a while," she said. "Tonight, just," she tied off the bandage carefully. "Tonight finished it." She looked up at him. "He is not a man who changes easily. But when he changes completely. It's one of the things I respect most about him, even when it takes far too long." She held his bandaged hand in both of hers for a moment. "He will not make this easy. He is not built for easy. But he will not actively oppose it anymore." "That's enough," Silas said. For now, she said yes. She released his hand. He looked at the bandage she had wrapped, neat, precise, perfectly done. "You're good at that," he said. "I'm good at most things," she said, with a directness that was not arrogance but simply accuracy, the statement of a person who had spent years being told she was not good at things and had arrived finally at the bedrock of knowing what she actually was. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. In the kitchen light, after the fire, after everything, her face was completely unguarded, in a way he had seen only a handful of times, open, present, no distance maintained between what she was feeling and what was visible on her face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, not because of any particular feature, but because of what it meant. Because of how much it had cost her to get there. He thought about the east field they had cleared together. About 4 posts adjusted the correct angle, about a gate hung true and clean, about a trough sealed against slow loss. He thought about all the small, patient, practical things that had built this moment, and he understood that this was what it looked like when you built something correctly, not dramatic, not sudden, but solid all the way down. The kind of solid that would hold in the first hard freeze and the second and every winter after. Outside, someone was talking to the horses. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Silas looked at Eleanor Caldwell and did not look away. He rode home from the Caldwell property that night with bandaged hands, and the smell of smoke still in his coat, and the cold air on his face felt like the clearest thing he had experienced in months. Not because anything was resolved, not because the hard part was over, but because for the first time since he had bought Dawson Creek Ranch, the shape of what he was fighting for had become completely clear to him, and there was a particular kind of relief in that. Even when the thing you were fighting for was still a long way from one. He had spent 11 years saving toward a place. He understood now that the place had only ever been the beginning of the thing. He unsaddled his horse in the dark, rubbed him down by feel, and went inside. He sat at his kitchen table with his bandaged hands in front of him and did not light the lamp. He just sat. He thought about Eleanor's hands holding his. The steadiness she had maintained and the tremble underneath the steadiness. He thought about Augustus Caldwell's hand on his shoulder, the weight of it, the plainness of it. He thought about the 4 horses in the yard, all alive, and the trench cut in the dry ground between the fire and the grain storage, and the 3 of them working it together without anyone directing anything. Just 3 people who all understood what needed to be done and did it. He thought about what it meant to earn a thing, not to be given it. Not to negotiate for it, but to earn it through the long, grinding, daily practice of being exactly who you said you were, even when nobody was watching, especially when nobody was watching, until the people who needed to see it finally looked in the right direction at the right moment. He went to bed. He woke at 4 in the morning with his hands throbbing and his mind already working. He was up and dressed before the pain had time to register as something that should stop him. He went to work. The burns were not severe enough to keep him from working, but they were severe enough to make every grip a negotiation. He adapted. He had been adapting to the limitations of what he had his entire life: not enough money, not enough help, not enough time, not the right tools, not the right weather, and burned palms were simply the current item on that long list. He wrapped them in the way Eleanor had shown him, tight and clean, and he found the tasks that required less grip and he did those first, and he worked his way toward the harder ones as the morning went on and his hands loosened. He was replacing boards on the interior of the barn wall, left-handed when the right got too difficult, when he heard the sound of not one horse on the road but several. He came out of the barn. There were 4 riders coming from the north, and he recognized Caldwell's brand on 2 of the horses before he recognized any of the men. The other 2 horses he recognized a moment later, the Haverford brothers, Gus and his younger brother Will, riding alongside 2 of the Caldwell hands with the ease of men who had arranged something in advance. Gus Haverford pulled up at the gate and took off his hat. "Mr. Boone," he said, "we heard about the fire last night. We heard what you did." He looked at the ranch, at the work that was visible from the gate. We thought you might be able to use some hands. Silas looked at the four men. He looked at his own wrapped hands. He thought about 11 years of handling everything alone. He thought about the post he had nearly set at the wrong angle, because he had not asked for help. He thought about what Eleanor had said, months ago now, sitting beside a fence rail in the evening. Accepting kindness was not surrender. It was trust. I could use some hands, he said. He opened the gate. They came in and he put them to work, directing each man to a task that matched what he could see about their skills from the first few minutes of watching the older Caldwell hand to the barn framing, where the work required experience. Will Haverford to the fence line, because he moved with the easy competence of someone who had strung wire since childhood. The younger Caldwell hand and Gus to the field preparation, where additional muscle would make the most difference. He organized it quickly, without ceremony, and then he went back to his own work. By noon, the barn interior had progressed further than it had in the previous week. By evening, the northern fence line was effectively complete. Silas had coffee on the outdoor fire, and the five of them sat with it in the cold air and said little and felt, in the particular way that men who have done genuine work together feel, satisfied in the specific, uncomplicated way that only actual accomplishment produces. You're going to make something of this place, Gus Haverford said. It was not flattery. It was the assessment of a man who understood land. That's the plan, Silas said. You'll have opposition, Gus said. I've had opposition, Silas said. Gus looked at his coffee. Caldwell's different now, he said slowly. I don't know what happened last night exactly. I know what I heard. But whatever it was, the man I saw this morning when I spoke to him about coming here he's thinking differently. Doesn't mean he's going to make it easy. But there's a difference between a man who's fighting you and a man who's got doubts, and Augustus Caldwell has got doubts. Silas said nothing. She's a good woman, Gus said. Not explaining who, not needing to. My wife was very fond of her mother. I've watched Eleanor since she was 12 years old. There is not a better or more capable woman in this county. He looked at Silas directly. That's not a small thing I'm saying. I know it's not, Silas said. Gus nodded. They finished the coffee. The men rode home in the last of the light. Silas stood at the gate and watched them go, and then he turned and looked at his ranch, the straight fence, the repaired barn, the cleared fields, the water trough that no longer leaked, the gate that swung true, and he let himself feel it for a moment. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than pride. The particular satisfaction of a man who has made something real out of something that was broken, and knows that the making of it is the most honest account of who he is. Then he went inside. He was writing in his ranch journal that evening, left hand because the right was too stiff, noting the day's work and the progress and the tasks remaining, when he heard a horse at the gate. Late, well past dark, he took the lantern and went outside. Eleanor was at the gate. She was still in her riding coat, her hair slightly undone from the ride, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has arrived at the moment when it needs to be set down. He opened the gate. "Come in," he said. She tied the mare and came inside into the kitchen. And he hung the lantern and put the coffee on, without asking if she wanted it, and she sat at the table and said nothing until the coffee was ready, and he had set it in front of her and sat across from her with his own. "My father spoke to me tonight," she said. "He waited." He said. "Started again. He asked me what I wanted. Not what he wanted for me, not what he thought was appropriate or reasonable or realistic. He asked me what I wanted." Her voice was careful, the way a person is careful with something that still feels fragile. "I don't know if you understand how significant that is. How many years it has been since he asked me that question." "What did you tell him?" Silas said. She held the coffee cup in both hands. "I told him the truth," she said. "I told him that I wanted to stay in this valley. That I wanted to work. She looked up from the cup. "I told him I wanted to see what this ranch was going to become." Silas was very still, and he said. He was quiet for a long time, she said. And then he said that if this was my decision, he would not stand against it anymore. That he could not promise he would not have opinions. but that his opposition was finished. She paused. And then he said something I was not expecting. What? He said he had been thinking about your mother. Her voice was quiet. I had told him about her, months ago, in one of our arguments about how you taught yourself to read in a bunkhouse, about how she believed that effort was a kind of prayer. He said he had been thinking about that. He said a man who was raised by that kind of woman, had she stopped. He said has a foundation I cannot buy and cannot manufacture. Those were his exact words. She looked at Silas. He meant it as a compliment, the highest kind from my father. Silas looked at his coffee. He felt something move in him that he did not have a precise word for, not sentiment, not weakness, but something that had more weight than either of those things. Something that had to do with the woman who had died when he was 12, and the hands he remembered, and the belief she had carried about the worth of honest work, and the idea that those things had outlasted her, had traveled forward through him, and had arrived here, at this table, recognized by a man who had spent 30 years building a different kind of monument. He's a complicated man, Silas said. The best ones are, Eleanor said. They drank their coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up, running through the valley from the northwest with the particular edge that meant the season was finally, genuinely turning. Winter was coming. There was no longer any ambiguity about it. The north pasture fence, Silas said, the last section. I need to finish it before the ground freezes hard. I know, she said. I'll come tomorrow. He looked at her. In the lamplight, at his kitchen table, drinking coffee he had made without asking if she wanted it, talking about fence sections and ground frost, the way two people talk about the shared contents of a life they are building together. She looked. He thought, like the most real thing he had ever been in the same room with. Eleanor, he said. She looked at him. I need you to know something, he said. Before anything else happens, before your father changes his mind again, or the weather changes, or something else up to make it complicated, he kept his eyes on hers. I have spent most of my life working toward a piece of land. I understand now that the land was never the actual destination. He paused. You are a better addition to this ranch than every improvement I have made to it combined. And I am not talking about the fence posts. She looked at him for a long moment. That, she said, is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. And it involves fence posts. I'm a practical man, he said. You are, she said. I find that I don't mind it at all. He reached across the table, his burned hand wrapped in her careful bandaging, palm up. She looked at it, then she put her hand in his. They sat at the table in the lamplight with the wind outside picking up, and neither of them said anything, because the important things had been said, and the rest of it was just time. The first hard frost came 6 days later. Silas had finished the north pasture fence the day before. Eleanor had been there for the last section. The two of them working fast against the sky, that told them clearly that the ground was going to change overnight. Driving the last posts with the efficiency of people who had been doing this long enough that they no longer needed to discuss the process. They had finished with an hour of light to spare, and to Silas had walked in from east corner to west and pressed each post and found every one of them solid, and Eleanor had walked it behind him and agreed. It'll hold, she said. It'll hold, he agreed. When the frost hit that night, the fence held. He walked it in the morning, pressing each post again in the new cold, and every one of them stood exactly as it had been set, and he thought about that first afternoon, months ago, when Eleanor had told him his angle was wrong, and he had made himself listen, and he thought about all the things that had been built, on that one moment of being willing to be corrected. He was at the barn when the Caldwell buggy arrived. Not Eleanor's horse. The formal buggy, the closed one with the driver, which meant it was Augustus. Silas straightened and waited. Augustus got down without hurrying. He walked toward the barn with his hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold air, and his face had the look it had worn since the fire something worked through, something resolved at cost, something that had not yet arrived at comfortable, but had arrived at honest. The fence looks good, Augustus said, looking at the north line. It does, Silas agreed. Augustus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the barn, the new roof section, the repaired framing visible through the open door. "I have a proposition," he said. Silas waited. "I have 300 head of cattle I need to winter," Augustus said. "My main pasture capacity is reduced because of the barn situation. The damage is more extensive than it first appeared, and my east pasture fencing needs to be replaced before I can use it safely." He looked at Silas directly. "Your property has the south pasture that you haven't stocked yet. Good grass, good water access from the creek, and I can see you've maintained it." He paused. "I would like to lease that pasture for winter grazing." "Standard rate, paid in advance." Silas looked at him. He calculated what a standard winter grazing lease would pay. He calculated what that money would mean for the spring purchases. He had been planning the livestock he wanted to bring in, the equipment he needed. He also calculated what this was beyond the practical transaction. This was Augustus Caldwell coming to Silas Boone's ranch and asking for something. Not offering, not proposing a deal that primarily benefited himself. Asking for access to something Silas owned, at Silas's terms. "South pasture can handle 300 head comfortably through winter," Silas said. "I'll want the cattle rotated at the midpoint to prevent overgrazing." "Agreed," Augustus said without hesitation. "I'll manage the rotation myself." "Agreed. And I'll need full access to the north gate on my property during that time for the movement." "That's your gate," Augustus said. "You don't need my agreement to use it." Silas looked at him. "Standard rate, paid in advance," Silas said. "Yes," Augustus said. They shook hands. Augustus's grip was firm and deliberate, the handshake of a man who meant it. His eyes stayed on Silas's through the whole of it. "She told me you said she was a better addition to this ranch than every improvement you'd made to it," Augustus said. He released Silas's hand. His voice was rough. "Combined—" Silas said nothing. "She was smiling when she told me," Augustus said. "I have not seen her smile like that in—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that he did not suppress, and it surprised Silas, that glimpse of what was underneath the authority, the raw fatherly thing, the years of it. "A very long time. She should smile more often," Silas said. "She has reason to." Augustus looked at him for a long moment. "Don't hurt her," he said. "Not a threat. Something more serious than a threat." "No," Silas said. "I don't intend to. Intending and managing are different things." "I know," Silas said. "I'll manage." Augustus nodded once. He climbed back into the buggy and drove north. Silas stood in the yard after he had gone, and what he felt was something he had to stand still with for a moment before he could move on, because it was larger than he expected, not triumph. Nothing as simple as that. But the particular weight of a thing that has been fought for, and is finally, partially, provisionally, won, and the weight of it is partly the relief, and partly the understanding of how much it mattered, and partly the awareness that it is not finished, that nothing worth having is ever finished, that the maintaining of it will require the same daily effort as the winning. He went inside. He wrote in his ranch journal. He wrote, 300 head, south pasture, winter lease, paid in advance. He wrote the rate and the terms. Then he wrote, below the practical information, in the left-handed script that was slightly less neat than his usual, August Caldwell shook my hand today. He meant it. He closed the journal. He went back to work. Eleanor arrived that afternoon to find Silas organizing the south pasture gate in preparation for the cattle delivery. And when he told her about the lease agreement, something moved across her face that was not surprise, but was better than surprise, the expression of someone who has been hoping for a specific thing, and has just received confirmation that it was not foolish to hope. He came to you, she said. He did, Silas said. He doesn't do that, she said. He doesn't go to people. People come to him. I know, Silas said. I charged him the standard rate anyway. She looked at him. Good, she said. He'd have respected anything less. He looked at her. Your father said something to me, he said. He said you were smiling when you told him what I said. About you being a better addition to this ranch than every improvement to it combined. She held his gaze. He said he hadn't seen you smile like that in a long time. She was quiet for a moment. I haven't had reason to, she said simply. For a long time. The cattle arrived 2 days later, 300 head moving up from the Caldwell property in the gray morning cold, driven by 4 of Augustus's ranch hands with the smooth efficiency of practiced men. Silas opened the south pasture gate and directed the movement, and the cattle came through in the particular organized chaos of large animals, doing something they mostly understood. And within an hour they were settled, and the hands had ridden back north, and Silas was alone at the gate, listening to the sound of cattle on his land. 300 head, not his cattle, not his ownership. But his land, his pasture, his creek water, his fence holding everything where it needed to be. He stood at the gate for a long time. He thought about the morning he had first walked this property line, before sunrise, before anyone could see his face, pressing his palm against the broken barn wall and saying quietly, to no one, "All right, let's get to work." He thought about everything between that morning and this one. He thought that if he had been told, on that morning, how it would go, the woman who came to his gate with money he would refuse, the fence post she would correct, the fire, the father, the burned hands, the handshake, he would not have believed it. Not because it was improbable, but because hope has a way of making itself smaller than reality allows for, and he had kept his hope very small for a very long time. He closed the gate. He went to find Eleanor, who was in the barn reviewing the repair work on the interior with the specific assessing attention she always brought to structural questions. "The south secondary beam," she said, not looking up when he came in, "needs to be reinforced before you put weight on the loft." "I know," he said. "I was going to get to it." "Get to it now," she said. "You'll have the income from the lease to cover the materials." He looked at her. "You sound like a person who intends to be here for the long term," he said. She turned and looked at him then. "Yes," she said. "I do." He held her gaze. Something had been approaching for months, building the way weather builds, and they had both known it was coming and had let it come at its own pace, because neither of them was a person who rushed structural decisions. But it was here now in the barn in the cold morning air. With the cattle settled in the south pasture, and Augustus Caldwell's handshake still present in Silas's palm, and Eleanor looking at him with the particular directness that was the most fundamental thing about her. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't make a speech," she said. "You're not built for speeches, and I prefer you as you are." He almost smiled. "Will you marry me?" he said, 3 words and a question mark. Practical and direct. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said with the same simplicity, no elaboration. No conditions, no performance, just yes. They stood in the barn in the cold and the quiet, and then she turned back to the secondary beam and said, "Now, I want this reinforced before noon," and he picked up his tools because she was right, and there was work to do, and the beam was not going to reinforce itself. He worked with his burned hands and his full heart, and he thought that this was probably what happy pass actually felt like from the inside, not the condition you thought you were building toward, not the arrival at a destination, but the ordinary morning, the correct angle, the solid post, the work beside someone who understood what the work was for. He thought about telling Eleanor that, then he decided she already knew. He reinforced the beam. She checked it when he was done. "Good," she said. He agreed. He was at the water trough the following morning, the last cold of the season, checking the repair that had held through the first hard freeze. Pressing his palm against the sealed surface the way he had done every week since they had fixed it together, when he heard Eleanor's mare on the road from the north. But she was moving faster than usual. He straightened. She pulled up at the gate and dismounted without tying the horse, which she never did, and she walked toward him with a purposefulness that was different from her usual approach. "My father wants to speak to you," she said, "today." At the house, Silas looked at her. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing bad," she said quickly. She stopped. Took a breath. "He told me this morning that he intends to provide a settlement. For me, when we marry." She held Silas's eyes carefully. "He was clear that it is for me, not for you. He said he wants to be sure that I am protected." His word. Silas said nothing. "He said it is not a commentary on your ability to provide," she continued. he said. She almost smiled. He said any man who charges standard rate to his future father-in-law does not need charity. Silas looked at the trough. He looked at his hands. He thought about $740. He thought about 11 years. He thought about what it had meant to him to have this place be entirely his own, no debt, no obligation, no one else's money in the foundation of it. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about what it meant to let people love you on their own terms, even when the terms were complicated, and came from complicated people. "He's doing it for you," he said. "Yes," she said. "Not for me." He was very clear about that. "Then I'll hear what he has to say," Silas said. She nodded. They rode north together on the cold road, side by side, and the valley was quiet around them. And the mountains were the way the mountains always were, enormous and patient and utterly indifferent to the small human dramas playing out at their feet, which was, Silas had always thought, one of the most useful things about mountains. Augustus met them in the yard of the Caldwell property. He looked at them coming up the road together, and something moved across his face, not the complicated resistance that had characterized so many of their interactions, but something that was closer to simple recognition. Two people on horses, the way they rode, the fact that they had arrived together without coordination, because being together was already the natural condition. He walked out to meet them. He looked at Silas. "You asked my daughter to marry you," he said. "I did," Silas said. She said yes, she did. Augustus looked at Eleanor. "You're certain," he said. Not accusatory. Just check. The fundamental question of a father who, for all his complications, had spent 30 years trying to protect this woman, even when his methods were wrong. "Completely," Eleanor said. Augustus looked back at Silas. "Then come inside," he said. "We have things to discuss." They went inside. They discussed things. The settlement was straightforward and generous, and came with no conditions attached to Silas's management of his own property. And Silas accepted it with a directness that Augustus respected, because it was not performed gratitude but honest acknowledgement, one rancher to another, of a practical arrangement. They sat at Augustus Caldwell's kitchen table with coffee, 3 of them, and talked about the winter grazing, about the spring, about what Silas planned for the east field when the ground thawed. Augustus had opinions about all of it. Several of his opinions were good. One of them was wrong, and Silas said so, and Eleanor said so simultaneously, and there was a moment of surprised silence, and then Augustus made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family. "Fine," he said. "Fine." It was the first ordinary argument they had ever had, and it felt like the beginning of something. On the ride home, Eleanor said, "He liked that you disagreed with him." "I know," Silas said. "He's a man who respects opposition from people he respects." "You figured that out quickly." "I figured that out the first day," he said. "I just had to wait for him to respect me before it was useful." She looked at him sideways. "That is a very patient strategy," she said. "I'm a patient man," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Silas," she said. "Yes. When I came to your gate that first day, with my father's envelope," she paused. "I was so certain you would take the money. Everyone I knew said you would. That no reasonable person would refuse $1,200 for a broken ranch." She looked at the road ahead. "I was not prepared for a man who was unreasonable in exactly that way." He thought about that. "I was prepared," he said, "for the ranch." "I was not prepared for you." She turned and looked at him. "No," she said softly, "neither was I." They rode back to Dawson Creek in the cold afternoon, and the fence line was visible from a mile away now, straight and solid against the winter-pale grass, running from corner to corner of the property, holding everything inside it that needed to be held. He had built that fence one post at a time. He had built everything that mattered one piece at a time. He looked at Eleanor riding beside him, her back straight, her eyes clear, her hands easy on the reins, and he thought that this was the post that would hold longer than any other he had set in his life. That this was the angle you got right once and then you built everything else from it, and that the man who had walked this property line alone in the dark before sunrise, afraid and certain in equal measure, had made every decision correctly. Even the ones that looked like mistakes from the outside, because they had all led here. The gate of Dawson Creek Ranch came into view. They rode through it together. He did not close it behind them. He left it open, the way you leave a gate open when you expect people to come through it, when there is something worth coming to on the other side, when the place you have built has become, at last, fully and finally, a home. They were married on the second Saturday of October. In the small white church at the edge of Miller's Crossing that had stood in the same spot since once 871, and had heard enough promises to know the difference between the ones that would hold and the ones that would not. The ceremony was simple. Silas had not wanted anything elaborate, and Eleanor had agreed with the particular firmness of a woman who had spent years being offered elaborate things as substitutes for genuine ones. They had discussed it once, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee, the way they discussed everything directly, practically, without performance. Small Eleanor had said, small Silas had agreed. The Haverfords, Doyle if he wants to come. Silas had looked at her. Doyle. He was doing his job, she said. He was never cruel about it. And he's been decent since the fire, she held Silas's gaze. I believe in not keeping score when a person hasn't earned the debt. He had thought about that. The Haverfords, he said. Doyle, your father. She had nodded. Her father had not been an easy presence in the planning of it. Not obstructive, he had kept his word about opposition, and he had kept it cleanly, without the passive undermining that a smaller man might have employed. But he had opinions about the church, about the date, about the reception he wanted to host at the Caldwell property afterward, and expressing those opinions was his way of participating in a thing he was still, in the private corners of himself, working to fully accept. Eleanor had let him have the reception. She had held the line on everything else. It's a gift to him, she had explained to Silas. Needs to feel that he is giving us something. Not because he has to, because he wants to be part of this. Silas had understood that. It was the same understanding that had allowed him to accept the settlement, to accept the lease arrangement, to accept the men who had come to help with his ranch in the days after the fire. He had spent most of his life under the belief that needing nothing from anyone was the same as being strong. Eleanor had shown him, through months of patient demonstration, that the ability to reach something gracefully required as much strength as the ability to provide it. Sometimes more. The morning of the wedding, Silas was up before 4. He walked the fence line in the dark, the full perimeter, pressing each post the way he had pressed them every week since they were set. Every one of them held. The north pasture fence, the southern gate, the eastern boundary that he had started with on the very first morning, the posts that Eleanor had told him were angled wrong, and that he had reset correctly because he had been willing to listen. All of it solid, all of it whole. He stood at the northwest corner of the property, the highest point, and looked out at the valley in the pre-dawn dark, at the shape of the mountains against the slightly lighter sky, at the faint suggestion of the creek to the north, at the dark mass of the barn and the house and the fields between them, and he thought about the morning almost a year ago when he had stood in roughly this same spot with his palm against the broken barn wall. He thought, I built this, not alone. He knew that now in a way he had not known it at the beginning. He had built it with Eleanor's knowledge and Gus Haverford's hands, and Augustus Caldwell's cattle in the south pasture, and his own mother's belief about the worth of honest work traveling forward through him like a current through a wire. Not alone, but he had been the one who saw it. He had been the one who looked at a broken, abandoned, failed thing and saw what it could still become. That had been his. He walked back to the house. He put on the one good suit he owned, which he had purchased in Cheyenne for the occasion, and which fit him well enough, and he rode to the church. Eleanor arrived with her father. She was wearing a deep blue dress that was practical and beautiful, in the way that she was practical and beautiful. And she walked down the short aisle of the small church, with her hand on Augustus's arm, and her eyes on Silas, and she was not nervous. He could see that. She moved the way she always moved, with the settled, grounded certainty of a person who had thought carefully about what they were doing and had committed to it completely. He was not nervous either. He had made his decision months ago, on a fence rail in the evening light, and he had simply been waiting for the correct moment to make it official. The minister was brief. The vows were the traditional ones. Silas said his without flourish and meant every word of them. Eleanor said hers looking directly at him, and when she said the word honor, something in her voice gave it a weight that the word usually did not carry. As if she was not just promising, but also recognizing something that had been given to her, and naming it back. Augustus Caldwell in the front pew kept his eyes forward. But when the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," and Silas did, briefly and completely, and the small congregation of the Haverfords and Doyle, and 3 of the Caldwell hands, made the warm sounds that small congregations make. Augustus pressed his lips together and looked at his hands in his lap, and Gus Haverford, who was watching, saw the older man's jaw move, and looked away, because some things are private. The reception at the Caldwell property was generous. Augustus had put genuine effort into it, and the effort was visible in every detail: the food, the warmth, the way the main room had been arranged to hold people comfortably. He moved through the evening as a host with the ease of long practice, and he was gracious to everyone. And twice Silas caught him watching Eleanor from across the room with an expression that was not complicated at all. It was simple. It was a father watching his daughter be happy. Late in the evening, when the gathering had thinned and Eleanor was talking with Gus Haverford's wife near the fire, Augustus came to stand beside Silas. They stood together without speaking for a moment. "She looks well," Augustus said. "She does," Silas agreed. Another pause. "I owe you an apology," Augustus said. He said it the way he did most things, directly, without softening it, with the particular discomfort of a man who was not practiced at the words but was committed to saying them accurately. "For the deed inquiry, for Doyle, for Whitmore," he paused. "For all of it." Silas looked at Eleanor across the room. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You were protecting her the way you knew how to protect her. Your methods were wrong, but the thing you were trying to do wasn't." "That's a generous interpretation," Augustus said. "It's an accurate one," Silas said. "I'd rather be accurate than generous." Augustus was quiet for a moment. "She used to be different," he said finally. "When she was young, before people started differently. She was the most confident child I ever saw. She'd ride anything, argue anyone, take on any problem on this ranch without hesitation. And then she got old enough for people to have opinions about her, and those opinions—" He stopped again. His jaw was tight. "I watched it happen, and I didn't know how to fight it. So I tried to build walls instead, keep the opinions out. And all I did was," Silas said. Augustus looked at him. "Yes," he said. "She's not in anymore," Silas said. Augustus looked across the room at Eleanor, who had just made a point to Gus Haverford's wife that made the woman laugh, and who was standing in the middle of the conversation with the ease of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Augustus said, "She is not." He put his hand on Silas's shoulder, the same gesture as the night of the fire, the same weight and plainness of it. "Take care of her," he said. "She'll take care of herself," Silas said. "I intend to take care of the rest." Augustus made a sound that was definitively a laugh this time, brief and genuine. "Fair enough," he said. He walked away. Silas stood where he was, watching Eleanor, and felt something settle in him that had been in motion for a very long time. They rode home to Dawson Creek that night, to their home. He would keep thinking that in the days that followed our home, their home, and feeling the weight and the rightness of the plural, the radical change that one small word represented for a man who had owned nothing shared for 35 years. The winter came in hard and early. Silas had prepared for it. He had been preparing for it since the first week on the property, assessing what the ranch would need, what the structural weaknesses were, what had to be right before the cold locked everything in place. The cattle in the south pasture weathered it well. The barn held. The house, its fireplace properly repaired before the first freeze, stayed warm. The fence held in the first hard freeze and the second, and every storm after. Eleanor managed the cattle rotation as the winter deepened, tracking the grazing patterns and the pasture conditions with a precision that impressed even the Caldwell hands, who came, periodically, to check on the herd. She kept a record in a journal of her own, not the practical daily log that Silas kept, but a more analytical document, tracking soil recovery, grass regrowth rates, water usage, the data from which she was already building the plan for how they would manage their own stock when spring came and they could afford to bring in their first herd. She talked about the plan the way she talked about everything, assuming Silas wanted to hear it, which he did, and expecting him to push back if he disagreed, which he did when he disagreed, and incorporating his corrections without ego the same way he incorporated hers. It was the most functional working partnership he had ever been part of. It was also, he thought, on a quiet evening in January, when the snow was deep outside, and the fire was going, and she was at the table with her journal, and he was at the table with his, and neither of them had said anything for an hour. And neither of them minded, the best thing he had ever built. February brought a crisis he had not anticipated. He woke in the night to the sound of the cattle, not the ordinary sounds of animals in winter, but the particular agitation that meant something was wrong. He was out of bed and dressed and outside before Eleanor was fully awake, and by the time she followed him, he had identified the problem. A section of the south pasture fence had given way under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. The one section that had been set before Eleanor corrected his angle, a section he had repaired but had not fully replaced. And the cattle were moving toward the gap with the inevitable stupidity of animals who could see an opening and could not understand why the opening was dangerous. He was at the fence before the first animal got through. He was holding the wire back, with his bare hands in the dark and the cold, calling to Eleanor over his shoulder for the tools that were in the barn, and she was already at the barn, already in motion. And she came back with what he needed in under 3 minutes, which was as fast as a person could do it, and they worked the fence in the dark and the cold. Fingers numb, breath visible, working fast and sure and together. They got it closed. They walked the herd back from the gap. They stood on the wrong side of the repaired section, too cold to talk, breathing hard, and Eleanor looked at the fence and then looked at Silas. "That's the section you didn't replace," she said. "I know," he said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "We'll replace it in the morning," she said. "We'll replace it in the morning," he agreed. They went back to bed. In the morning, in the proper light, he pulled the entire section and replaced it with new posts at the correct angle. Eleanor held the wire while he set each post, both of them working with the particular efficiency that comes from having done this together, enough times that the rhythm of it is automatic. And when they were done, she walked the full line and pressed each post and found them all solid. "Better," she said. "Better," he agreed. He looked at the replaced section and thought about the section he had set correctly, the very first day she came back, when she had told him the angle was wrong and he had adjusted it. He thought about how a single correct angle, applied consistently from that point forward, had held through an entire Wyoming winter without failing. He thought about how one corrected mistake, when you were willing to make it, changed everything that came after. April came like a door opening. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, the way it always did, and the creek ran high and fast with the melt, and the south pasture began to show green in the low areas where the water fed the roots, and the cattle. 300 of Augustus Caldwell's animals, who had wintered safely on Silas Boone's repaired, rebuilt, refused to be sold land, moved toward the new growth with the uncomplicated gratitude of creatures who do not know they should be somewhere else. The Caldwell hands came to move the herd north in the second week of April. Silas and Eleanor helped with the movement, working the gates and the trail, alongside the Caldwell men, with the ease of people who had been part of the same operation all winter, even if Hackable belonged to a different brand. When the last animal went through the north gate, and the gate was closed behind them, the south pasture was empty for the first time since October. It did not feel empty, it felt ready. 2 days later, Silas came home from Miller's Crossing with the paperwork on 8 head of cattle. He set the papers on the kitchen table in front of Eleanor without explanation. She looked at them. She looked at him. 8, she said. "It's a start," he said. She looked at the papers again. At the breed he had selected, which she had mentioned once, months ago, as the best choice for the South Pasture's grass type. He had remembered. He had been planning this purchase since that conversation. "You remembered what I said," she said. "I remember everything you say," he said. "I find it useful." She looked up at him. Her face did the thing it sometimes did when he caught her off guard with something. The composure shifted, not falling away entirely but becoming translucent. And what was underneath it was unguarded and complete, and more honest than most people managed in their entire lives. "Silas," she said. "The grass is good," he said. "We'll have room for 20 by autumn if the pasture recovery holds." "It will hold," she said. "You calculate it." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. And she did not mean the cattle. He knew she did not mean the cattle. "You don't thank me for basic accuracy," he said. And she heard her own words from months ago return to her, and she smiled, the full smile, the one that rearranged her face and was gone quickly and stayed in the air. The cattle arrived the following morning. 8 head, moving into the south pasture through the gates Silas had opened, onto land that had been failed and abandoned and mocked and threatened and fought over and repaired and rebuilt and filled all winter with animals that didn't belong to him. And now, for the first time, held something that did. He stood at the gate and watched them move into the field. Eleanor stood beside him. He did not have a speech. He was not a man who made speeches, and she did not want one, and the moment did not need one. What it needed was exactly what it had: 2 people standing at a gate they had built together, watching a beginning in a place that had started as something everybody else had given up on. 8, Eleanor said. 8, he confirmed. By autumn 20. "If your calculations hold." "My calculations hold," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "They do." In May, Gus Haverford brought his family to Sunday supper for the first time. And it was a good evening with easy conversation, and Gus's wife talking to Eleanor for most of it, with the warmth of people who have been waiting for an occasion to be friends properly. In June, 2 more families in the valley came to them for advice about their own fence lines and soil conditions, because word had gotten around quietly. In the way things get around in small valleys, that Eleanor Boone knew what she was talking about, and Silas Boone's ranch was evidence of it. Eleanor talked to every family that came. She did not minimize herself. She did not preface her knowledge with apologies for having it. She did not wait to see if they flinched at the fact that she was a plus-size woman who knew things they did not know, and some of them did flinch briefly, and she let that be their problem rather than hers. Because she had been letting it be their problem rather than hers for over a year now, and the practice was becoming a habit she intended to keep. Silas watched her work. He thought about the first day, the carriage at his gate, the envelope, the money he had refused. He thought about how little he had known then about who she was. He thought about what it said, about a person's that you could know them for almost a year, could work beside them every day, could be married to them through a Wyoming winter, and still find yourself surprised by the fullness of who they were. He thought it said something very good. In August, Calvin Marsh at the feed store stopped Silas on his regular supply run and said, grudgingly, in the way that Calvin Marsh did things that did not come naturally to him, "That ranch looks good, Boone." "I'll admit that." He said it as if the admission cost him something, which Silas thought it probably did. "People were wrong about you." "Some people," Silas said. "Calvin had the decency to look uncomfortable." "Some people," he agreed. Silas finished his order and drove home. He told Eleanor about it at supper, and she said good in the clipped, decisive way she said things she considered settled. And then she said, "Pass the bread," and that was the end of that. He passed the bread. He thought about Calvin Marsh watching from the feed store window as everything he had been certain of failed to fail. He thought about the town that had laughed at a man who bought a broken ranch, and about the woman they had calculated and dismissed and reduced to a number on a scale, and about what it meant that both of those things, the ridicule and the dismissal, had been wrong in the same direction. They had looked at what was broken and seen an ending, and the actual story had been a beginning. Augustus Caldwell came to Sunday supper in September. He came alone, the way he had been coming since May, driving himself in the smaller buggy, tying his horse at the gate post with the ease of a man who had made this trip enough times to have it become comfortable. He was different on these visits than he had ever been in Silas's experience of him. Not smaller Augustus Caldwell was not a man who became smaller but less armored. He ate supper at their table and argued about cattle management, and conceded points when Eleanor made them and held his ground on the points he was right about, and had gradually, over the course of a summer's worth of Sunday visits, arrived at something that looked, from the outside, very much like contentment. After supper, while Eleanor was in the kitchen, Augustus sat across the table from Silas with his coffee and looked around the room for a moment. "I came to look at this place when it went up for sale," he said. "Before you bought it, I walked the property." Silas looked at him. "You were going to buy it," he said. "I was thinking about it," Augustus said. But he paused. The barn was in bad shape, and the fields were overgrown, and the fencing was completely gone on the eastern side, and I looked at all of it, and I thought it would take more work than it was worth. I thought. He stopped. He looked at his coffee. I looked at it, and I decided it was too far gone. Silas said nothing. "I was wrong about that," Augustus said. "Yes," Silas said. Augustus looked up. "I was wrong about a number of things," he said. "Yes," Silas said again. "I'm not going to make a list," Augustus said. "I didn't ask for one," Silas said. Something moved across Augustus Caldwell's face, that compressed thing again. Too many layers. But the dominant one was clearer now than it used to be. Clearer than it had been in the feed store and at the gate, and at every confrontational moment in the long months of this story. The dominant thing was respect. "No," Augustus said. "You never did." Eleanor came back from the kitchen and sat down, and the three of them talked about the spring until the hour was late, and Augustus said good night and rode north in the dark the way he always did. And Silas and Eleanor stood at the gate and watched the buggy lights go. "He's coming to terms with something," Eleanor said. "He's been coming to terms with it since the fire," Silas said. "He's almost there," she said. "He'll get there," Silas said. "He's a man who gets where he's going. He just takes the long way." She turned and looked at him. "You like him," she said. He considered that honestly. "I respect him," he said. "I understand him. And I believe he is trying to be better than he was, which is the most you can ask of any person." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "You know," she said, "when I came to your gate that first day with my father's money, I thought you were going to be a problem to be managed." "I know," he said. "You were considerably more than that." "As were you." She smiled. He opened the gate, and they walked back toward the house, and the October air was cold and clean, and the fence line was visible even in the dark, running straight and sure around everything that mattered. And somewhere in the south pasture, one of their cattle made a sound, easy and unhurried, the sound of an animal exactly where it belonged. He thought about Dawson Creek Ranch as he had first found it, every fence post down, every gate off its hinges, every field choked with 7 years of abandonment. He thought about the people who had looked at it and seen only failure. He thought about the people who had looked at Eleanor and seen only what she was not. He thought about what it meant to look at something broken and see what it was still capable of becoming. He thought about the woman walking beside him, who had stood at his gate with money he refused and come back on her own terms and stayed because she chose it, who had taught him the correct angle for a fence post and the correct ratio for a trough repair and the correct way to understand what strength actually was. He thought about 11 years of saving, and the morning he had walked this property line alone in, the darken, and the word he had said to himself against the wall of the broken barn. "All right, let's get to work." He looked at Dawson Creek Ranch, rebuilt, restocked, alive with the daily honest industry of two people who had found each other across the wreckage of other people's certainties, and decided that what everybody else had given up on was exactly worth fighting for. He looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him with the full, clear eyes of a woman who had stopped letting other people's vision define the edges of her life, who had ridden onto a stranger's broken property and found the one man in the territory who saw her first, completely and without condition, and had never once looked away. This was the ranch that nobody wanted. This was the woman everyone had miscalculated. This was the man who had looked at an abandoned thing and known, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had never confused giving up with wisdom, that some things do not stop being worth saving just because everyone else has stopped believing in them. And in that quiet Wyoming valley, in the long clear autumn of 1890, Silas and Eleanor Boone proved what the broken places had always known and the comfortable ones had always forgotten, that a second chance, given to the right person, held by the right hands, built back one honest day at a time, does not merely survive, it becomes the strongest thing standing.